This video was originally recorded April 2016 during the ongoing Force for Good class series happening in New York City and online each year. To learn more about this ongoing series, visit tibethouse.us.
Welcome back, everybody. So I recognize many faces, and that's great. But in order to have some continuity, it helps me to know what people have heard before and what they haven't heard before. So just a quick show of hands. Who was here on the first night a week ago, Tuesday night at Tibet House? Okay, a couple of you weren't. And then who was at the Jewel Heart one on Thursday? So most of you, but a few missed. Okay, what I'm going to do tonight is very, very quickly recap, that's what's on my outline here, recap of previous talks very quickly, but I won't spend too much time on them. I will assume that in one way or another you know this information. But very briefly, you'll remember that we talked on the first night here about the three different vehicles that appeared at three different historical periods: individual vehicle, universal vehicle, exoteric, and then the esoteric or Vajra vehicle, tantric vehicle. And each one of these has a different set of ethics associated with it, and they build on each other, so you can look at them almost like concentric circles. And that's something we'll be talking about and emphasizing tonight again, is why that's important. So I won't go over that again. The other thing that's really important is to remember that the key to all of this is renunciation. Renunciation is foundational, and I will just spend a couple minutes on that. But then actually even deeper than that is wisdom. Renunciation is really renunciation and wisdom are both the key to, from a Buddhist point of view, individual liberation. So what liberates you from your own suffering is initially renunciation, which is, we'll talk about in just a minute, which has to do with really, it's not so much turning away from the world as it is turning away from an addicted relationship, an unhealthy relationship to the world or to life. So getting that in order. And that really has to do, of course, with getting deeper insight into the three root addictions of fundamentally misknowledge, and then what comes from that, desire or grasping, and anger or hatred. And then many other ones develop after that, pride, envy, and many others. But you'll notice that all of those are rooted in of the three, those are actually rooted in the one, which is misknowledge. So misknowledge, which is the misunderstanding of the nature of the self, in particular, thinking that you have a self that is independent and autonomous and somehow separate from everything else, that's actually what makes the whole thing go around. That's what makes samsara happen. And from the Buddhist point of view, that's actually just considered a misperception. It's a misconception and a misperception. It can have various intellectual forms, but it also definitely occurs on a very subliminal, subconscious level. So getting insight into that, first understanding, that's what wisdom is about then. So wisdom actually, that's why I say wisdom is the deepest key. Wisdom, or the understanding of the nature of the self, or actually the nature of selflessness, is actually the key to everything. And it's also the key to all of Buddhist ethics, therefore. So one thing we talked about, I think it was last week at Jewel Heart, was the way in which, let me bring up my other page here, the way in which sometimes all of Buddhist practice is seen as divided into the Eightfold Path, right? The Fourth Noble Truth is divided into the Eightfold Path, which is here on the left, and that is grouped into wisdom, ethics, and meditation as terms of disciplines or practice. And what I spent a good amount of time going over at Jewel Heart on Thursday was the way in which, in fact, when you look, this has become sort of a normal categorization of Buddhist theory and practice. But this is only a couple sutras that actually sort of put it together this way. If you look at the majority of Pali Sutras and Mahayana traditions as well, you actually find that meditation actually provides a supportive role for the other two. And actually, if you want to distill Buddhist theory and practice down to its essence, it's really those first two, wisdom and ethics. So it's wisdom and ethics are the two main things, and meditation is providing a support role for those two. So wisdom and ethics, we've just mentioned wisdom. At this fundamental Buddhist level, as you know, fundamental individual vehicle level, I should say, Fundamental ethics has to do with at least avoiding the 10 non-virtuous actions, 3 of body, killing, stealing, we're taking that which is not given, and sexual misconduct. Remember those 3 of body, 4 of speech, which are lying, harsh speech, divisive speech, and idle speech. We talked about those on the first night, and we elaborated them on at Jewel Heart. And then the 3 of mind, of course, which are covetousness, connected with the klesha of grasping and attachment, malice, connected with the klesha of hatred, and then mistaken or incorrect views, unrealistic views, which is, of course, connected with the klesha of the addiction of misknowledge. So those are the basic 10 paths of negative action you avoid, and you practice the opposite 10, the positive, saving lives, telling the truth, and so forth. That's basic Buddhist ethics. So individual liberation, or actually just betterment within samsara, within life, actually just having a happier sort of karmic trajectory, is accomplished just through doing those 10. So you don't even have to be a Buddhist. Anybody in samsara who practices those 10, the Buddha and Buddhist traditions counsel, even if you're not going to be a religious person or a Buddhist, you do those 10, your life will improve, your overall trajectory will improve, your happiness will improve. But remember, that was sort of this ascendant level. To get to the transcendent level, where you're not just ascending within possible realms within samsara, but you're actually trying to transcend it, or transcend your relationship to it, you want to transform it, really. That requires wisdom. The wisdom into selflessness. That is the key to everything. And what we're going to be talking about today at some length is the way in which wisdom informs the kinds of ethics that happen in the universal vehicle, or the Mahayana. So, and then what we'll see then, of course, is that ethics in the Mahayana becomes broadened out to, or you could say distilled down to, really kind of one word, which is compassion. So you can say wisdom and compassion, those two in an integrated way form Buddhist practice at the universal vehicle or Mahayana level. And sometimes compassion then, you can substitute for compassion, they're not the same word, but they're related ideas. You could say upaya, or skillful means, skill and liberative technique. That's a related topic, which we'll be talking about tonight, related to compassion. Or you could say bodhicitta, the spirit of awakening, mind of awakening, or spirit of awakening. So these 3 terms, compassion and upaya, or skillful means, and then bodhicitta, those are all sort of related terms on the sort of the ethics side of the equation in the Mahayana point of view, and then there's the wisdom side. And these 2 have to be integrated. You can't sort of do one and not the other, or do one halfway and the other. You have to do them both in an integrated way. Of course, in practice, you're developing each one of them incrementally, and each of them is informing the other. But I like a lot talking about, as I did on my first talk here, not looking at things in terms of black and white, but rather to the extent that. So to the extent that you've developed some insight into wisdom that informs your Mahayana ethics, to that extent, your Mahayana ethics become supercharged. And to the extent to which you're able to practice Mahayana ethics, to that extent it will support your wisdom insight into selflessness. So these 2 support each other. They're sometimes spoken of as being 2 wings of a bird. A bird can't fly with 1 wing, and those 2 wings have to work in coordination for the bird to fly well. So one comment that, just to mention, one comment that one person mentioned to me after the last talk was that the talk was great, they appreciated a lot of things that I said, but they didn't hear as much about ethics as they would have liked to. Although I thought I talked quite a bit about ethics at the last talk, I was aware that I spoke probably maybe a third or a half about renunciation and wisdom as well. And what I want to emphasize now, in light of that comment, is that these are all so integrated that you really can't separate them out. You can separate them out provisionally, and that's something we'll certainly be doing. But keep in mind that this kind of provisional or heuristic separation, they really are so integrated that if we spend some time tonight talking about wisdom or selflessness or renunciation, we are talking about ethics, and vice versa. Each one of these supports the other in a very integrated way. So we'll talk more about selflessness and wisdom, but first later on. But first, to talk about renunciation, just to recap what we talked about there. I won't go through all of this, but I looked at the etymology of this term in some depth, and you can look at the video if you weren't there. But in short, what we come to see is both in the Sanskrit and its Tibetan translation, whereas renounce or renunciation is the usual translation, really the 2 parts of this word have to do with doing something definitely and then some verb having to go, or to emerge, or to go. So Hopkins' literal translation of definite emergence is very literalistic. But if you want to get something that's maybe works better, perhaps decisively move on. And I talked in that talk about, if you're in a bad abusive relationship that you're addicted to, sometimes it's hard to get out of it, but one day you wake up and you realize, really as an act of self-love, the right thing to do is to get out of this relationship. And when you make that decision decisively and you really do it, you decisively move on, that ngenjung in Tibetan means something like that. That's ngenjung in Tibetan, or back up here, these various Sanskrit words, nisarana, niryati, and so forth. So something to do with maybe decisively moving on. We could perhaps say let go. I've highlighted some words in red that are translations I kind of like. Determination to be free works. Self-compassion, Gaelic Rinpoche oftentimes speaks of this. It's not an actual translation, but it gets the gist of what this is about, self-compassion. And I mentioned that, and I think maybe at the talk here, but definitely at the Jewel Heart talk as well, because really when you first decide if you're addicted to something, when you actually finally decide that you're going to break that addiction to another abusive person or to a substance, alcohol or something, it's actually that first decision that you're going to break that addiction, kick that habit, and move on with your life is an act of self-love. So that's a nice way to talk about it. I also like Thupten Jinpa's version of it. Again, it's not a literal translation, but it gets the idea across of disenchantment, becoming disenchanted with the world, with addicted life, with samsara. So these are all the ideas. This is all sort of what this idea of renunciation has to do with. Again, it doesn't have to do so much with leaving the world, although sometimes if one is, really an addict, let's say a serious alcoholic, you do have to stop going to bars, maybe for your whole life or maybe for a while. You have to give up that circle of friends or drinking buddies. It doesn't mean you hate them, it doesn't mean you don't want to ever see them again, but sometimes it's the lifestyle is so alluring that you have to, at least for a sustained period, not go to the bars and not hang out with your drinking buddies. Maybe in the future, if you've really kicked the habit, you can get back together with them and continue to have a friendship. Maybe you could even go back to bars and have conversations with people and drink your soda. But that's something you have to assess for yourself. But the idea here is that renunciation, likewise in the Buddhist context, doesn't mean you're leaving the world behind. You're specifically renouncing samsara, which means a particular way of actually creating the world. I think I spoke about that here before as well. Samsara is less a place that you're born into. We see the wheel of samsara depicted in paintings with the heaven realms and hell realms and human realms and ghost realms and so forth. It looks like this is sort of a picture of, continents or something, or planets you could be born onto. In a way, it sort of is, but they're really realms. They're realms of experience. Shantideva even says in his book, Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life, that the hells are actually basically a mental creation. They're like nightmares. They're very, very real for those who live there, but it's something that's being dreamed. It's something like a matrix kind of creation. So samsara is really something we create. It's something we do rather than a geographical place that we're born into. So renouncing samsara really means stop doing samsara, stop making samsara, stop creating samsara. We see this in the opening chapter of the Vimalakirti Sutra, which is, I'll read some from tonight, but this is a wonderful sutra that Bob Thurman translated that I strongly recommend everybody read. In terms of really getting an understanding of the Mahayana sort of vision and spirit and what it feels like, this covers everything. And it's a short sutra, as you can see, but it's a wonderful story. It's this narrative, it's this magical story, but so much is covered in here in terms of Buddhist doctrine and practice and so forth. In the opening scene, as some of you know if you've read it, this very question comes up where a more naive realist, Shariputra, who's actually somewhat of an enlightened individual, but in the individual vehicle, thinks that samsara is this sort of external thing that just has to be rejected. And certain individual vehicle practitioners may see samsara that way. So he's sort of the fall guy. He plays that part in here, saying, well, samsara is terrible, we got to get out of here. And the bodhisattvas in here, the Buddha and Vimalakirti, confront him and confront him throughout the sutra with that being sort of a dualistic way of thinking. And a more non-dual, more subtle way of understanding is that it's not that it is this bad thing out there, it's that you are seeing it that way. So in the opening scene, the Buddha touches his toe on the ground, and spontaneously everybody, including Shariputra, suddenly sees that the world is actually already a Pure Land. It's already a Buddhaverse. but that because of his own addictions, because of the impurities in his own mind, he's seeing it as this horrible samsara he has to escape from. So temporarily, he enables sort of a magical power, Shariputra, to suspend his creation of samsara and see that, in a way, you can also see this is already a perfect universe. But it kind of depends how you're relating to it. And then he takes his toe back up, and Shariputra goes back to seeing it the way he did, and the bodhisattvas don't, and then there's a whole things transpire from there in the sutra. We'll be reading from this later today, some important passages. So we've discussed then that ethics and wisdom are really the essence of everything on any vehicle. So the question tonight is going to be what kind of ethics in the Mahayana or the universal vehicle, what distinguishes that? What makes it different from ethics in the individual vehicle? Because the wisdom component should be the same across all vehicles. One useful, let's see, bring this back up. One useful way to look at this, my page is jumping around here, sorry. Okay, I want this one. Tsongkhapa has a very wonderful text called The Three Principles of the Path, which I may or may not read, depending if we have time. Here we go. So I have that as my next note on here. Tsongkhapa's Three Principles of the Path. This is translated, among other places, in Thurman's Essential Tibetan Buddhism, pages 112 to 114. It's only a page and a half, just a few verses. Perhaps in the interest of time, I won't read it right now, but these the three principles of the path that he discusses are precisely renunciation, and in the few verses that he discusses there, he talks about the need to really contemplate deeply on a personal level some of the things I talked about at the talk at Jewel Heart. Really think about the preciousness of human life, karma, death and impermanence, and so forth. Those kinds of thoughts that really turn the mind towards spiritual practice. So, and if you do that deeply, and not just sort of an item of doctrine or an item of things you memorize or intellectually think about for a day, if you really think about that on a personal level for days, weeks, months, maybe even years, it does have an effect over time of really sort of turning you towards more spiritual things and less towards things having to do with the ego. If we say turning away from this life and turning towards liberation, you could also say turning away from the ego and towards egolessness, selflessness. So the opening verses talk about the need to do that, and if you do that, you develop this thing called renunciation. After which he then talks about the need to develop the spirit of enlightenment, or bodhicitta. It's not just enough to recognize the nature of your own suffering and what's causing it and to try to stop doing that, but to recognize that all sentient beings are really your equals. They're all your relatives, they're your mothers, and so forth, and to actually then have genuine compassion for them, and more than just compassion for their suffering, actually develop the strong wish, the urge to alleviate their compassion, not just sort of pity them, but actually the feeling you yourself want to do something to alleviate that, and then the realization that the only way you can do that is if you become fully awakened yourself as a Buddha. So that aspiration to become awakened as a Buddha yourself, primarily so that not only does that entail your own liberation, but so you have the skill set to help alleviate the suffering, the cause of suffering for all other mother sentient beings. That's bodhicitta. That's the spirit of awakening, which we'll be discussing at some length tonight, because again, that sort of is Mahayana ethics. And then finally, the third principle of the path. First is renunciation, second is bodhicitta, the third then is wisdom. And he has a few just beautiful, succinct verses in here about the nature of wisdom, and particularly about the nature of non-duality. Understanding that, in particular, emptiness or voidness is actually a negative term that means the lack of intrinsic reality. And understanding that emptiness and appearances, as it's usually translated, or as I prefer to translate it, perceptions, are actually two sides of the same coin. They're actually non-dually interrelated. So the very fact that you can see things means that they're actually empty of intrinsic existence. The fact that things are empty of intrinsic existence means that they can relatively interact and relate. Interdependent origination, causality, relationality can happen precisely because they're empty of intrinsic fixed natures. So everything is a construction, and because of that, where we'll go in the final talk on tantric ethics, the ramification of that everything is actually construction, is that you're actually responsible for your constructions, and so you might as well construct things as optimally as possible. And tantric theory and practice has to do with doing that. Although, as we will also perhaps see, so I won't read these verses, but they're in here. But as we'll also see, even short of tantric Buddhism, where they have some real specific techniques for doing that, using specific visualizations and so forth, even in exoteric Mahayana Buddhism, which is our subject for tonight, for example, in the Vimalakirti Sutra, there's quite a bit written about the kind of ethical requirement that it's incumbent upon the Bodhisattva to try to see the world in an optimal way. So we'll talk about that as well. So basic ethics of individual vehicle Buddhism are foundational for Mahayana ethics. Renunciation is foundational, wisdom is the key, and then Tsongkhapa's 3 principles of the path we just discussed is another key way of looking at that. My next bullet point here is under universal vehicle teachers and Sangha, meet a Bodhisattva teacher. Why do I say that? Because it's easier said than done, probably. But the reason I say that is it's one thing to study all this, to take classes, to read books, to sort of try to understand it, and that's important, right? That's of the 3 types of practice or of learning the facts and then contemplating it and wondering about it and asking questions and doubting it. It's the middle. Third is integrating it, right? You got to do all that, but it really, really helps. It changes everything if you meet somebody. I say meet a Bodhisattva. Again, that might be easier said than done, but if you meet perhaps a Tibetan Lama, perhaps His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or perhaps a Zen master or some other fairly advanced spiritual teacher in the Buddhist tradition who you think, there's no way for us really to know is somebody a Bodhisattva or not, but if you meet a person who others say is sort of universally, like the Dalai Lama, universally claimed to be somebody pretty spiritually special, and who has spent their life studying with, really special teachers and masters their entire life. This is what they do, it's their career. If you meet somebody like that, it can change everything. I know it has for me, and I know many people for whom that's the case. You can study this stuff for 10 years, and then one day you meet somebody like the Dalai Lama, hear him give a few words, say a few words, you're in his presence, and it's one of those things you can't explain. It's like, it's a nonverbal teaching, but you suddenly see what it's like and feel what it's like. At least you have a sense of what it might be like to be somebody who's actually been practicing this at a deep level for many years, maybe many lifetimes. So it awakens a completely different and energizes your own understanding of what's possible, your horizon of what you think is possible, or what you thought what it was you were studying for 10 years suddenly changes and opens up. So if you can find a teacher that you connect with who you think has some of these qualities, that's number one, very special. This is not a guru. A lama does mean a teacher in Tibetan. It's the translation of guru. But we're not talking about the kind of the guru-disciple relationship. That there is a special kind of relationship that occurs in Tantric Buddhism or Vajrayana Buddhism. And there's reasons for that. We'll talk about that in the next talk, what the nature of that relationship is. In exoteric universal vehicle Buddhism, which is what we're talking about tonight, the teacher that you meet is called a Kalyana Mitra, or a spiritual friend. It's something that you could translate it as a mentor. So it's not somebody who's going to tell you to do whatever you have to follow them slavishly. It's really somebody who's going to be almost like a psychotherapist. Somebody who's really going to help you hopefully manifest good ethics and good teaching and understanding, answer your questions, and be a model for you. So a spiritual friend is a nice translation for Kalyana Mitra. You meet somebody like that, and then secondly, engage with a Sangha of aspiring bodhisattvas. Maybe people who aren't yet bodhisattvas, but who have studied this and for whom this is a worldview that is inspirational. If you can study and practice and talk and get support from other people doing this kind of work, it really helps compared to doing this all by yourself in your own apartment. It's kind of hard. So I think we are all supposed to as Buddhists, take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The Sangha sometimes gets short shrift. The Dharma is really what you take refuge in that actually, or go for refuge to, I should say, that really actually frees you in the end. But the Buddha is the teacher, like the doctor, and the Sangha, which is like the medical support staff, are also important. And sometimes we overlook the importance of the Sangha. So to the extent possible, if you can join or engage or make your own Sangha, that will definitely help. So if we then jump to the key or essence of Mahayana, as I've already mentioned, is this notion of bodhicitta, or the spirit of awakening. And you'll oftentimes read or hear about there being 2 kinds of bodhicitta. And it can be confusing because when books or lamas talk about two kinds of bodhicitta, there's two different kinds of two kinds. So one kind of two is ultimate relative, and the other is aspiring and active or engaging. And these are not related in some sort of one-to-one way. They're just two different ways of talking about bodhicitta. So if we look at the second one first, it's the easier one to understand perhaps. Aspiring and active or engaging bodhicitta. This is discussed at some length again in the Shantideva's book, The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. This is your handbook for all of Mahayana Buddhism. If you buy it now, the cover looks different. I like Stephen Batchelor's translation, but there's 10 or 15 translations out there now. They all have their merits. Another one, some done from Sanskrit, some done from Tibetan, some done from both. They all have different merits, strengths, and weaknesses. The one by, let's see, what's it called? The Bodhisattvas, The Way of the Bodhisattva, that's a good one. It's a red book done by Padmakar Translation Group. I have some strong disagreements with the way they present wisdom in their introduction, but other than a couple pages. But other than that, it's a good translation. It's been reviewed by scholars as being one of the better translations. It's got a very excellent appendix in the back where the translators talk about two practices that we'll be talking about later today that come up in this book. One is the exchange of self and other, and one is equalizing self and other, and one is exchanging self and other. So they have a good commentary on that, and also the 30-page introduction is also excellent, except for the couple pages on wisdom that I have some disagreements with. But that's a good translation. The third translation that I would say is really good is by Crosby and Skilton, and that's done just from the Sanskrit. It's, I think, in the Penguin Classics. What's helpful there is their own commentary. They have a commentary at the beginning of each of the 10 chapters, just a short commentary that really lays out what's in the chapter and gives it a really nice analysis in the introduction. More of a scholarly approach, but again, the kind of information you'll get out of it is excellent. In terms of just the feel of the language, this is one of the earliest ones done in the 1970s by Stephen Batchelor. You know, some people have pointed out some mistakes or faults here and there, but still overall, it's my favorite one. But the best thing you can do is, the Dalai Lama has said, by the way, as far as practicing Mahayana Buddhism goes, this is your handbook, this is the one book you should have, this is your desert island book. And he has said, quote, that this should be on your nightstand by your bed because it's the one book you're reading constantly, you know, before you go to sleep and when you wake up, and that over the course of your life, over years, it should become blackened because you've been turning the pages so much. Blackened and dog-eared and ripped up because you're constantly referencing it. So this really is and I think I may have mentioned before, this is also considered one of two texts that becomes the source text for what becomes the mind training tradition later on in Tibet. Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life and Nagarjuna's book that I talked about in the Force for Good lecture. This is Nagarjuna's Jewel Rosier Ratnavali. These two books are the two books that form the basis of what becomes a huge genre of literature and teaching practice in Tibet, the mind training. So we'll be quoting from this a couple times tonight as well. But what Shantideva says in a number of chapters, he spells out precisely what aspiring and active or engaging bodhicitta are. And in brief, he says, it's as simple as, aspiring bodhicitta is simply the wish to go to a city. It's like the wish to go to a city. I want to go to Paris. And if you want to go to Paris, you have to make all sorts of plans, pack your bags, buy an airplane ticket, maybe look online, maybe get some ideas where you're going to visit. It all has to do with planning and aspiring to do something. Engaging is then when you've actually done all that preparatory work and now you're on your way. You're in the taxi, you're on the plane, you're actually on your way to Paris. So aspiring bodhicitta is precisely, it's learning about what it means to be a bodhisattva or a Buddha. And remember, the study part is part of it. The contemplating part has to mean doubting. It has to mean, well, what is this liberation? Is this really even possible? This sounds like a pipe dream, you know. And we as Westerners especially, but not only, I mean, we shouldn't assume that Tibetans or Indians or Asians in general, they just automatically sort of believe in rebirth and reincarnation and therefore have an automatic leg up on us. In some ways it can actually be the other way around because it can be accepted as a cultural, it's so much a part of the culture that it's not doubted that can be problematic. Because again, from a sort of standard Buddhist point of view, your average garden variety sentient being, like I assume most of us are, really does believe, it has firm conviction that they have a real self. And ironically, or paradoxically perhaps, the strong conviction in having a separate self tends to make you not believe in reincarnation. Because it's hard to explain why that is, but it has to do with thinking this is what's permanent. The idea of not having a self, that you don't have a permanent self, that you're actually just sort of this causal flow, the more that starts to make sense, the more you recognize you don't have a self, even from moment to moment in this life, the more the idea of continuity starts to make sense, and the more the idea that continuity continues forever makes sense. And it's not so much the idea that there's rebirth, like there's this life and that life, and you're somehow reborn. There's not a you that's reborn. Actually, the you that came into this room 20 minutes ago and the you that's here now is not the same person. You think there's all sorts of dots you connect and think it's the same me, but actually there's all this constantly changing flow of experiences, impressions, and ideas and memories that you sort of connect these dots around and say that's a self, that's a me. Whereas in fact there's some sort of more of a causal flow going on. Again, once this starts to break down and make more sense, the idea of an infinite horizon of time, I wouldn't even necessarily call it rebirth and reincarnation, because rebirth and reincarnation sounds like this Tom here in 2016 is going to be reborn as that animal or that human or that woman or that man in the year 2092 or something in some other country. There is some reality to that, but it's no more real or no less real than the reality of, you imagine yourself as a 2-year-old, if you can. Remember yourself as a 4-year-old, or as far back as you can remember. There's certainly some continuity there between that person and who you are now, but you almost look at that as an alien being, like somebody else. And likewise, I covered this briefly in the Jewel Heart talk the other night. When you're looking towards the future, you're going to be around, hopefully, let's say 30 years from now, but that's almost like a different person. Like the money you save, you're saving money and you're maybe smoking or not smoking now with an awareness of the cancer that could or may or may not occur 30 years from now. But that is almost a different person. It's almost a different body that you're thinking of. But we do that. We sort of invest money and maybe quit smoking because we're worried about this body that's going to be around 30 years from now that really isn't even you. So it's a strange thing. The more you start to deconstruct this notion of self, the more you start to think differently about the horizon of time involved. To the extent to which, so this connects to aspiring and active engaging bodhicitta. Why? It even connects to individual vehicle Buddhism, this notion of liberation, because that's a pipe dream, unless this notion of samsara makes sense. Yes, you can take Buddhism, Buddhism without belief, sort of throw this idea out and just say, well, I want just a humanitarian, sectarian, not sectarian, but Buddhism just for here and now, just for this life, like existential sort of Buddhism. There are people who do that, that's fine, it helps them be happier people. From a Buddhist point of view, that's that ascendant level we talked about. Don't do the 10 non-virtues, make your life happier. Liberation Buddhahood is a pipe dream. When you die, you're gone, that's it. Some people want to believe that and they want to practice, that's fine. There's a place for that within Buddhist ethics. But it's not really Buddhism in the sense of Buddhism as a spiritual practice that aspires to or claims that there's this possibility of transforming things radically. So even at the individual vehicle level, the notion of radical transformation, not creating samsara and becoming liberating from that, does entail some real deep contemplation that could take years, that has to do with deconstructing the self, deconstructing the idea that you really exist in the way you think you do, at least. And that actually starts to open up the horizon for an infinite future, actually. And that then just imagine, like right now, we probably don't believe that, if we're honest with ourselves. But if you do sort of turn the corner to where that actually becomes the more plausible worldview rather than the less plausible one, when that becomes more plausible, that, oh, maybe something that's continuing here is going to continue on forever, then suddenly it actually is rather frightening, because rather than being something, sometimes people think Buddhists and Hindus believe in reincarnation because that gets, yay, we get to be here forever. It's actually the other way around. It's actually kind of frightening because it means you're here forever. And it means it never ends. It means, you're going to, and to the extent to which karma is so determinative, karma is a big topic we don't have a lot of time to go into, but basically your actions of body, speech, and mind are constantly shaping sort of who you are. And there's a lot of karma that has not yet come to fruition from an infinite past that means your future may or may not be as fantastic as you probably think it's going to be. There may be some pretty nasty, unripened karma from the past that's awaiting you in the future unless you do something about it. So the idea of an infinite future is not necessarily some automatic, celebratory thing. It's actually kind of frightening on that level. It's also frightening on the level of even if you get on with the task of working towards your own liberation and working on the Mahayana level of, aspiring to be compassionate for everyone. It actually becomes daunting, and the Dalai Lama has written a lot about this. Shantideva writes a lot about it. It becomes very discouraging. It becomes terrifying. Because the aspiring bodhicitta is the aspiration, not only may I become liberated, but may I become a Buddha in order to take care of all beings. Well, that means you're going to take care of every single being. All beings is a nice sentiment, right? Save all sentient beings. When you slightly tweak that to save each and every sentient being, that means every single being you meet on the subway, on the way here, on the way back home. It means the person you can't stand, your worst, your boss, your worst enemy. That individual is an individual. You are taking responsibility for their total long-term happiness. You're going to learn to love that person and care about that person as much as you care about your best friend or your mother and so forth, or yourself. So that actually becomes pretty daunting too, to think about that, and also then to think about the idea that this may never end. This may actually go on forever. There's some dedication prayers that talked about that, and one of the Dalai Lama's favorite dedication prayers precisely foregrounds that. May I be around basically forever, serving the needs of beings. So again, this sort of changes the whole way that we think about everything. It also, rather than thinking we're going to get a vacation, like you get your 4-year degree and you're done, or you get your PhD and you're done, or you get your promotion in your job and you've made it. There's all these sort of milestones we like to have, which there's nothing wrong with milestones, but we have this sort of constant, I think, this constant habit of wanting to sort of see that when such and such happens, or when I acquire this or get to this level, then I've made it, I've done. When my kid finally moves out and is on his own, paying his own bills, whatever, when I retire, get my retirement check. There's always some sort of time when we can finally relax and it's all over. And from this perspective, that never comes. That time never comes. Even when you finally die and finally, your old body that's all, in pain and you're ready to go, you get to go through the bardo and come back again and get a new mommy and daddy and start all over again in kindergarten. And hopefully you have good teachers and good spiritual mentors and you can continue where you left off if your karma sort of ripens in that direction. And this is going to go on forever. So in a way, it's really actually frightening. And there's a lot written in Mahayana ethics about this and about the fact that if and when you've woken up to that level of being insane, and they talk about it being sort of a kind of insanity also. When you're to the point where you've even had that insanity realization, this is your chosen career, and they talk about it like this is your main career. You may also be a taxi cab driver or a professor or whatever your job is. Your career is your bodhisattva career. Everything else is kind of your job. So if this becomes your career, one of the Mahayana ethics that we'll see is you don't go around dumping this on other people who aren't ready for it. Most people aren't ready to take on this kind of commitment. So there's actually a lot of the bodhisattva vows have to do with assessing carefully who you interact with, where they're at, what kinds of ethical responsibilities are they able to take on. So aspiring is aspiring to do that, and active engaging is actually getting on with doing that, taking specific bodhisattva vows that we'll be discussing in a few minutes, and then trying to maintain those vows. So in terms of basic ethics, I'm not going to read I don't think I'll read it just in the interest of time. How are we doing time-wise? 7:42. There's some very useful information if you want to just get a quick overview of Buddhist ethics in these two books that we use in our Buddhist ethics course at Columbia. This is Peter Harvey's book, An Introduction to Buddhist Ethics, and then Damien Keown's book, The Nature of Buddhist Ethics, that I mentioned last time. And in these books, in Harvey, he mentions that Asanga's Bodhisattva Bhumi, which was just recently, we've been waiting for this for years in the West. There's this now in the last month or so, an English translation, a big, huge volume finally came out of this very important book. So Asanga, who is one of the most important, along with Nagarjuna, promulgators of Mahayana teachings, wrote a lot of important commentaries himself, discovered and brought to earth the teachings of Maitreya Buddha. His important book, the Bodhisattva Bhumi, or the Stages of the Bodhisattva, talks a lot about Mahayana ethics, and the Harvey book, pages 132 to 3, talk about that specifically, and about how early Mahayana ethics actually were much more rooted in some of his writings. So I won't go into that right now. What happens shortly thereafter, within a few centuries, is Shantideva comes along and he writes the Shiksha Samuchaya, or the Compendium of Practices, and also the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Those two books actually become the key books. They sort of supersede Asanga's writings, or they complement them, but they also supersede them in terms of sort of a formula for what Buddhist ethics is. And it's from Shantideva's Shiksha Samuchaya and then this sutra called the Akashagarbha Sutra in the Mahayana canon. Sutra was spoken by Shakyamuni. It's from these two sources that we get what becomes sort of formalized as the 18 vows, the 18 Bodhisattva vows. Harvey writes about this 133 to 4. And then there's another set of vows I'll be talking about down here. You can see right down here. There's a set of 18 and 46 secondary vows. I'm going to show you a website in a minute that discusses these in length. But before we jump to the specifics of the 18 and the 46 Bodhisattva vows, we'll stick a little bit more at the general level. It's probably helpful to note that in general, Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, verse 5:11, chapter 5, verse 11, mentions that intention is the key to ethics, and I'll just look at that with you real quickly. So that is and I'll explain what he means by that. So he's actually talking throughout this text about the, among other things, the 6 perfections or the 6 transcendences, which I have mentioned right here. And that is, of course, something probably most of you are familiar with. We'll discuss those at some length tonight as well. But the 6 perfections or the 6 transcendences, which are sometimes expanded to 10, is largely the topic of this book. And so in talking about the first 2, which is the transcendence or the perfection of generosity, and then the transcendence or perfection of ethics, he describes them briefly as follows. He says, this is chapter 5, verse 9. There's an interlocutor, there's somebody who's arguing. He argues with himself in this book a lot. Sometimes he argues with an imagined opponent. If the perfection of generosity were the alleviation of the world's poverty, then since beings are still starving now, in what manner did the previous Buddhas perfect it? Good question. Because a Buddha, by definition, is somebody who's perfected the 6 perfections, right? They've actually developed, they have perfect generosity. Well, how could you say anybody, Buddha or anybody else, ever perfected generosity? Because if he or she did, how could there still be poverty in the world, right? So that's the question, that's the setup. And then his answer in verse 10, the perfection of generosity is said to be the thought or the intention to give all beings everything, together with the fruit of such a thought. And hence it's simply a state of mind or an orientation. So the perfection of generosity doesn't mean, you haven't perfected generosity because you've alleviated all poverty in the world. It means your own intention is you will automatically give away anything and everything if and when anybody needs it. That's the perfection of generosity. And that is then, I'm reading that because that's a setup to the next pair of verses, which is sort of parallel, having to do with the next perfection, which is ethics. Verse 11, nowhere has the killing of fish and other creatures been eradicated. Okay, now this is a little bit sometimes difficult to understand, but here he's saying it's much more condensed. Here he's saying, likewise, like we still have poverty in the world, right? So how did the Buddha perfect generosity? We still have killing in the world, so how did the Buddha develop perfection of ethics? Because number 1 of ethics is not to kill, right? Not to engage in violence. So since we still see fish and other creatures being killed, how can you say the Buddha ever attained the perfection of ethics? That's kind of the implication in this first half of the verse. And the second half of the same verse answers, the attainment of merely the thought to forsake such things is explained as the perfection of moral discipline or ethics. So in other words, it's the intent, it's perfecting the intention to never kill and to always save lives, to never lie and to always tell the truth and so forth. You're perfectly pure in that way, and you're not being tainted by the 8 worldly obsessions, which I think, did we discuss that in this lecture, in this talk last time? 8 worldly obsessions are, your own personal gain and loss, happiness and suffering, and fame and disgrace, and praise and blame. Completely not involved with that, with sort of the ego being at the center of the act. You're either giving or you're practicing ethics in a way that where the ego's not part of the equation at all. That's then the perfection of generosity or ethics. So in a broad sense, then, Mahayana ethics has everything to do with intention. And therefore the six transcendences have everything to do with intention. And as we'll see in a minute, actually we'll see right now, I'll just mention this now. Of the six perfections then, wisdom is again essential. So we've talked about ethics and wisdom being the two sides. When you look at the six perfections, essentially what happens is the first five constitute ethics, and then the sixth one is wisdom again. But then again, it's a little bit funny because of the five, the second one is ethics. So, but anyway, the six perfections are the perfection or the transcendence. The word is paramita, parotachimba in Tibetan, and it means going beyond. And why? In what way is it going beyond? It's going beyond in one sense that you're going beyond ordinary generosity. Like everybody can be generous, but they're talking about sort of superhuman, cosmic level generosity here. So it's transcendent. It's a perfection. Again, I kind of don't like the translation perfection as much as transcendence. Transcendence means to go beyond. So it's not, when they say the transcendence of generosity, it doesn't mean you're transcending generosity. It means it's transcendent generosity. So generosity which is transcendent. It's happening at an extremely high level. It's transcending normal generosity, like at a samsaric level. What makes it transcendent, and this is why I say wisdom is essential, is precisely that it's informed by wisdom. So all of the first five paramitas or transcendences precisely become transcendences if and only if they're informed by wisdom. What does that mean? Well, we've talked about wisdom having to do with the understanding of the lack of intrinsic reality, lack of subject-object duality, lack of things being really separate. In an act of generosity, if you're giving food to an animal, or you're giving some advice to a friend, or there's all kinds of ways you can give. You can give your time, your energy, your compassion. There's all sorts of things you can give. If when you're giving something to someone else, in the process of doing that, again, your ego's sort of in there, you think, oh, I'm giving this to you. Then there's an I and a you that are separate, and there's a gift that's being given. So there's sort of, they talk about the three spheres, the giver, the recipient, and the gift. If you see those as sort of intrinsic things, still, that's great, it's good generosity, it can create good karma, but it's not transcendent generosity. Transcendent generosity, by definition, is generosity informed by wisdom, meaning you don't see those as three separate things. And one way of looking at that sort of descriptively, they sometimes will say, it's like if your act of generosity feels like repaying a debt to a friend. So if somebody gave you $10 yesterday, and today you give them $10, you don't feel like, oh, I'm giving you $10. There's not sort of a bunch of baggage associated with expectations or strings attached, right? I'm just actually repaying a debt. So that's one that sort of helps, at least moves in the direction of effectively what it feels like to have transcendent generosity. In the act of giving, you're not thinking you're doing some big thing. But when the wisdom informs it more deeply, it actually becomes even more profound than that. It's almost like you're taking the system view of it. Like you can inhabit the actor of the giver, which is what we always do. We inhabit our own sense of self. I'm giving this to you. But if you can sort of step out of that and sort of look at it from an outside perspective and just sort of see a system in which a person is giving something to another person, and in a sense, the balance sheet is equal, right? There's just something changing hands. In a way, what is ownership anyway? What is possession? Nobody really owns anything. There's just something moving. So you're sort of looking at it from an objective perspective where in a way there's just changes happening. Less, more so than sort of A is giving this to B, A is giving X to B. So looking at it more like that, it starts to move in the direction of transcendent generosity. If you then apply the same thing to ethics, you get transcendent ethics. The third one then is patience or tolerance. A very famous long chapter on that in here is a very important chapter, a wonderful chapter to read about what does it mean to be patient and tolerant. And then the fourth transcendence is the transcendent energy or effort. And again, this is sometimes explained as this is something which is applied to the other ones. So putting your generosity and your ethics and your tolerance on steroids, like really not just sort of doing it half-baked, but really doing it with full engagement and full enthusiasm. I think Batchelor actually translates the chapter as enthusiasm. This is actually a transcendence. The Bodhisattva works among the 6 things. The Bodhisattva actually works on developing a kind of enthusiasm for ethics in general. And counter to that, what's interesting in that chapter and some other chapters is what counters enthusiasm. He also talks about what counters each one of these and how to sort of go against the things that drag it down. One of the counters is not just laziness, which is the opposite of enthusiasm, but there's actually a being depressed or being disheartened or discouraged. These are all kinds of things that can dampen one's enthusiasm. And he has some very interesting verses, a number in here. You have to kind of search for them, but I've searched and pulled some out because I find it an important topic, particularly for Western Dharma practitioners. But it seems like depression and being disheartened and discouraged is a pretty common emotion that many of us feel in the West, even if we're not doing Dharma practice. But certainly if you try to do any of this, it can become pretty discouraging pretty quickly because it's so daunting. And he has some very interesting verses in here, as they do in the mind training text, about tackling that issue and about how actually, kind of interestingly, counterintuitively perhaps, when one feels discouraged or one feels depression, it's actually a form of the reification of self, of the self-habit, of the self-addictive habit coming in. And it's tied to the notion of pride of ordinariness, and he actually uses that term, as does Nagarjuna in the I think I quoted that verse in the Force for Good talk. In Nagarjuna's text, he talks about a pride of lowliness. What does that mean, pride of lowliness? Or pride of ordinariness, as it's sometimes called. We usually think of pride as, an inflation of I'm so great, I'm better than you, right? You sort of an unusually inflated sense of yourself or your accomplishments. Pride of lowliness or pride of ordinariness is exactly the same thing in reverse. It's an over-exaggeration of how inadequate you are and how useless you are and how stupid you are and how etc. But interestingly that the Buddhist psychologists call that pride as a kind of pride. It's a kind of pride is an inflated sense of identity, an inaccurate, distorted sense of identity. It's a kind of pride, and it's a kind of pride that actually holds you back because it gives you the excuse of, well, I'm just such a lowly, useless, stupid, incapable person. I couldn't possibly understand that, or I couldn't possibly be that generous. The Dalai Lama could because he's a saint and a bodhisattva, but me, I'm just nobody. So therefore, I've just now given myself an excuse to go on being selfish or mean or whatever else. So that's actually pointed out as a fault in Nagarjuna's text and in Shantideva's text to look out for and to not allow that to take hold, in part because it undermines everything, but it clearly directly undermines enthusiasm, and therefore enthusiasm is a kind of optimism. And interestingly, in Shantideva's book, again, an important theme, it's not taken out as like a paramita or perfection, but it is a theme throughout the text. And you see this in many of the Mahayana texts, is it's actually ethically incumbent upon the Mahayana practitioner to be enthusiastic and optimistic, which is, again, kind of, because we tend, I think, to be not only depressed, but also sort of pessimistic. But again, pessimism is nothing more than just a reification of a particular negative set of a negative view, which is not the way things are, it's the way you're choosing to see things, right? A glass half empty, glass half full type of thing. So depression and pessimism are actually things from a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva vows to not, in terms of taking on the vow to develop perfect or transcendent enthusiasm, part of what's incumbent there is vowing to work against the drag of depression and pessimism and work towards being optimistic and enthusiastic. So then the fifth paramita, the fifth transcendence, is the transcendence of meditation. So practicing that to a transcendent level, which therefore necessarily includes understanding selflessness. It can't just mean zoning out. Again, I've mentioned before, meditation is a much misunderstood and misused word, I think, in this culture. There's at least 10 or 15 different words that get translated from Sanskrit and Tibetan that mean very different things in the Buddhist context that all get sort of called meditation in the West. And they mean very different things. And there's different kinds of practices that one can do which can fall into the broad rubric of meditation, but can take very, very different forms. It's not just watching your breath, just being mindful, just calming down, just sort of seeing the nature of your mind. It can be a lot of different things. So the transcendence of meditation covers that full spectrum. And then transcendent wisdom itself is, of course, that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is transcendent. But again, wisdom is what makes the other 5 transcendent. So then there's a different list, a less popular list of 10, which is sometimes mentioned, which includes bala, spiritual power, pranidhana, having to do with aspiration or prayer or wishes, and jnana, which is interesting because it's more to do with intuitive wisdom as opposed to prajna. By the way, the perfection of wisdom here that we always talk about, prajna paramita, that wisdom, prajna, means analytic wisdom. It doesn't mean sort of spaced out wisdom directly intuiting something. It actually does mean, and the more you read about it, the more you'll see this in Nagarjuna or any of these texts, it means a kind of analytic, rational wisdom that cuts through dualities, analytically, rationally, and so forth. The kind of direct perception, what that then feels like on a more intuitive level, which is kind of an intuitive wisdom, which only comes from having done that, is then called jnana. And jnana is another perfection, but usually it's included in the perfection. The reason you don't have to have 10 is because the final 4 can be sort of included in the previous 6. So the 6 are the more common list you'll see. So prajna can sort of stand for both. In some contexts, depending on the context, either exoteric or esoteric, they'll distinguish between prajna, this analytic wisdom, and jnana, more of an intuitive wisdom, which comes from prajna. So the other side of the equation then, I mentioned earlier that in addition to wisdom, you have ethics, and I mentioned earlier ethics can either be ethics, or we can call it compassion, or we can call it bodhicitta. Oh, I'm sorry, before I move on, I skipped one thing. I shouldn't have skipped that. Back here, we talked about aspiring and active engaging bodhicitta. The other 2 types I didn't mention, ultimate and relative in brief terms. Usually, when we talk about bodhicitta, we mean relative bodhicitta. Relative bodhicitta is precisely these, kind of subdivides into aspiring and active. It has to do with bodhicitta in action or in aspiration. That's relative bodhicitta. Absolute bodhicitta is precisely the mind cognizing emptiness. So you could say absolute bodhicitta is really nothing more than the mind of wisdom. And relative bodhicitta is that, it's like emptiness in form, right? The form side of that is that which gets out there and actually does things. So ultimate and relative bodhicitta are sort of ciphers for, substitutes for wisdom and, in a way, wisdom and compassion, or, yeah, wisdom and compassion. And it's always understood that wisdom itself is what sets you free. In terms of your own liberation, it's your own insight into selflessness that actually sets you free. That manifests as, or eventually evolves into, the Dharmakaya of a Buddha, the Buddha's truth body, which kind of connects with the Buddha's mind. So the Buddha's own freedom is represented in or manifested in its Dharmakaya, Dharma body. So wisdom becomes Dharmakaya. Compassion, or merit sometimes, or bodhicitta, relative bodhicitta, becomes the form body, the physical body of a Buddha, which is actually a physical expression of compassion, the Rupakaya, which then divides into Dharmanakaya and Sambhogakaya. So, sorry, I forgot to go back to that, but that's just another way of talking about bodhicitta. So then we talked about the 6 and 10 transcendences. So another key concept within Mahayana ethics is, of course, upaya, or skillful means. What is that? And it's sometimes translated, it's usually translated to skillful means. That's the translation you're probably familiar with. I like Thurman's translation that he uses in the Vimalakirti Sutra, which we'll look at in a second, skill and liberative technique, translating the same term. And he nowadays prefers the translation art, which is actually not bad. It sounds funny at first because it sounds like, this kind of art. But it means the art of, like we have the art of, the art of painting, or the art of anything, art of motorcycle maintenance, art of being a good chef, the art of cello playing. It's a skill. It's a skill, but it's a skill that's taken to such a high level it's actually an art form. Well, what is the Bodhisattva's art form? The Bodhisattva's art form is precisely it's the skill of liberative technique. A Bodhisattva is an artist, is a master of figuring out, of assessing individual by individual exactly what can be done and should be done with body, speech, or mind to help this individual in this particular situation open up a little bit, chill out a little bit, relax a little bit, give up, give in a little bit, be more generous, and so forth. Move 1 micromillimeter in their direction of their own freedom. So the skill and liberative technique or art, that is what upaya is. So in a sense, it's bodhicitta in action. We talked about aspiring and engaging bodhicitta. Engaging bodhicitta when you're actually doing it. What are you doing? Well, what you're doing is you're trying to become a Buddha to awaken others. You're trying to become a Buddhist so that you can help others optimally. What does that entail doing? Well, it entails doing the 6 perfections. But another way of saying that, sort of in general terms, is it means developing skill and liberative techniques, which may mean giving something to somebody. It also it could mean almost anything. It could mean taking something from somebody. If that's what that person needed right then and there, to really sort of wake them up in some way, it can mean yelling at somebody, harsh speech. It actually, it's an interesting category, and it's a problematic category. It's an interesting category to discuss in undergraduate courses because, of course, it raises all sorts of questions, like suddenly the bodhisattvas can get away with doing anything. In a sense, yes, but the idea here is that the bodhisattva is only going to do those things. And this becomes a level of ethics that only makes sense, that's something you could apply to yourself. In other words, you can't get out and sort of put this out in the marketplace as, hey, everybody, we all should. Yes, you can do that with the 10 non-virtues. Everybody should, you can go out and teach and aspire to the 10 non-virtues, to not doing the 10 non-virtues. It's kind of tricky to get out there and just to sort of preach from the mountaintop that everybody should be altruistic and, give up their own self-needs and be compassionate towards others. That's something that's more of an individual choice. You can't tell somebody else to do that. And then when it comes to the upaya level, that's even more the case. So it really is a doctrine within Buddhist understanding that there are beings, a bodhisattva can get to, on the path through 10 bodhisattva stages on the way to Buddhahood, can reach a point in his or her ethical development where their insight as to what the situation is so clear, and their ego is so out of the equation that they can do exactly what's needed in that moment, and it may not look like it might be yelling at the person, or lying to the person, or smacking the person. I mean, it could look like something that, from normal conventional terms, is unethical. And what makes it ethical, what we saw in Shantideva, is the intention. We know that there's the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We know that's a slippery slope. Just because your intention is good doesn't. And where it is a slippery slope is if we think that this somehow gives license to gurus to be abusive, for example. And it does not. So it does not, what's interesting about this is it doesn't give license to anybody to do anything, but it does inform somebody who themselves is pretty confident that they have definite insight, they can see what's happening, they can see what's going to cause more or less suffering, and they can do the right thing at the right time. So you have examples of enlightened masters, whether it's Padmasambhava or Shakyamuni for himself for that matter, doing sort of actions that seem sort of extreme in certain cases, and that being sort of designated as, well, that's skillful means. That's kind of what was needed in that case. So there is this category. It is considered an important part of bodhisattva practice. It's important that it's discussed and understood, but it's not something that is put out there like, okay, everybody should from day one think that they're doing that, because the ramifications are extremely negative if a mistake is made. So if somebody is deluding themselves into thinking that they have more wisdom than they do, and they think, well, I've been meditating for a year now, and I've really got a glimpse into emptiness, and I'm a real bodhisattva, and I'm going to start smacking people around on the subway because I know it's good for them, or whatever. Or I can start drinking up a storm now because I'm halfway enlightened anyway. I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which your ego can kind of convince yourself of this. This becomes quadruply, infinitely more negative, because now you're deluding yourself that you're being this great Mahayana practitioner, and you're actually hurting yourself and hurting others, and it becomes extremely destructive very quickly, karmically speaking. So it is kind of a tricky thing, but where you can learn from it, where Mahayana Buddhists generally do learn from it, is in stories. Maybe there'll be a story of a teacher or a teacher you actually know who seems to really genuinely manifest real skillful means. Again, meeting somebody who does this well is an inspiring thing to see, and you can assess whether they're doing it well or whether they're a charlatan who's kind of tricking people. But the other way is in stories, and the Vimalakirti Sutra is filled with, that's again why looking at that sutra is a wonderful way of getting an idea of what does the bodhisattva who has skillful means do. But Vimalakirti is ruthless in a very, very gentle, compassionate, humorous way, with all these different people who come to him and ask him, they think they're understanding the Dharma in the right ways, and he kind of puts them in their place and kind of shows them where they're off. And it's not harsh speech, but it's not really belittling speech, but it is embarrassing to each of them. Because in the story, he manifests as being sick, right? If the frame story is that the Buddha is teaching in this one place, and he hears that this householder, this layman named Vimalakirti off in another town, who's actually a bodhisattva, we learn pretty quickly, he's sick. And we learn that he actually is pretending to be sick, or he's manifesting being sick. But because he's sick and he's this great sort of well-known householder and bodhisattva, you want to send people to go attend to him, like, oh, how are you doing? Can we get something for you? Can we bring you some food or water? Can we help you somehow? So the Buddha says, hey, somebody, go see after Vimalakirti, see how he's doing. And then each one of these different disciples, pretty highly, enlightened individuals on the individual vehicle, tell a story as to why they don't want, they're kind of too embarrassed. It's like, well, I'd rather you not pick me to go ask after Vimalakirti's help, because one time when, and he starts to tell a story, and each one, it's significant. You look in the footnotes, you see that Upali, each of these different people who's reluctant, has a particular skill. They're sort of known within the Sangha, like this is the person who's really got the Vinaya down. He's perfect at maintaining Vinaya vows, or he's really good at wisdom, or he's really good at some particular skill set within the Dharma. And he'll then tell a story about how when he went to Vimalakirti 10 years ago, something happened, and Vimalakirti put him in his place, kind of showed where he was misunderstanding precisely that thing that he was supposed to be so skillful at. And the point isn't he's just showing that he's, in each case, Vimalakirti is showing from a non-dual perspective how it is that that particular practice or practitioner was over-reifying a particular practice. So the whole thing is actually showing from a Mahayana perspective this sort of vision of non-duality, of what it means to have transcendent ethics or transcendent generosity and so forth. So you kind of learn by example, and this is Vimalakirti's upaya, or skill and liberative technique. And so that is the, I say here, the affective and or the effective side of compassion and bodhicitta. And the last bullet point there, wisdom and art must be combined and integrated. You can't just have one without the other. And that's where I will read some brief passages. Actually, I can read it from here, but I can also project it, which is what I'll do. Let's see, time-wise, 8:10. So this is a website at Columbia that's, you have to have a password to get into it and so forth, but I recommend you get the book anyway. But just for the sake of being able to talk about it tonight, I'm going to project it from this password projected website, because that way you can see the words. So he's sick, as I just mentioned, and there's a whole long discourse about that, which is fantastic, which we're going to skip over. And then at one point, Manjushri, the Bodhisattva wisdom, asked Vimalakirti, well, how should a sick Bodhisattva console himself? How should another Bodhisattva console a sick Bodhisattva? And he gives him a long teaching about that. And then he moves on to this piece here, which we're going to talk about briefly, where the question is, okay, well then Manjushri asked, noble sir, how should a sick Bodhisattva control his own mind? That's the part we're going to read a couple passages from here on. Vimalakirti replied, Manjushri, a sick Bodhisattva should control his own mind with the following consideration. Sickness arises from total involvement in the process of misunderstanding from beginningless time. It arises from that, when you get a flu, this isn't how we normally think. This is how you're supposed to think. You trace it all the way back. It arises from the passions, that's the addictions, right, the kleshas, that result from unreal mental constructions. And hence, ultimately, nothing is perceived which can be said to be sick. Why? The body is the issue of the four main elements. And in these elements, there is no owner and no agent. There's no self, so he's very much of a wisdom teaching here. There is no self in this body, and except for arbitrary insistence on self, ultimately no I, which can be said to be sick, can be apprehended. Therefore, thinking I should not adhere to any self, and I should not rest in the knowledge of the root of illness, he should abandon the conception of himself as a personality and produce the conception of himself as a thing, thinking, this body is an aggregate of many things. When it's born, only things are born. When it ceases, only things cease. These things have no awareness or feeling of each other. When they are born, they do not think, I am born. When they cease, they do not think, I cease. Furthermore, he should understand thoroughly the conception of himself as a thing by cultivating the following consideration. Just as in the case of the conception of self, so now the conception of thing is also a misunderstanding. It's a construct. And this misunderstanding is also a grave sickness. I should free myself from this sickness and should strive to abandon it. So this is, those of you who've studied a little bit of Buddhist philosophy, this is Pudgala Naratmya and Dharma Naratmya, the emptiness of the self and the emptiness of things. Both are empty, equally empty. Okay, well, what is the elimination of this sickness? It is the elimination of egoism and possessiveness. So that's what sickness actually really is. What is the elimination of, I love, a lot of sutras do this. They kind of unravel sort of a series of things. What is the elimination of egoism and possessiveness? It is the freedom from dualism. What is the freedom from dualism? It is the absence of involvement with either the external or the internal. We're going to go through this quickly now. As you can probably tell, each one of these sentences, when you're reading, you need to stop and think about it. And each one of these really merits stopping and really thinking about it. All right, so what is the absence of involvement with either external or internal? It is non-deviation, non-fluctuation, and non-distraction from equanimity. Well, what is equanimity? It is the equality of everything from self to liberation. Why? Because both self and liberation are void, empty. Well, how can both be void? As verbal designations, they both are void, and neither is established in reality. Therefore, one who sees such equality makes no difference between sickness and voidness. His sickness is itself voidness, and that sickness as voidness is itself void. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Sickness is empty, emptiness is sick, I guess. The sick bodhisattva should recognize that sensation is ultimate. Okay, now I'm going to skip here. This is all really good stuff, but I want to jump to this next part. So Manjushri, thus should a sick bodhisattva control his own mind in order to overcome old age, sickness, death, and birth. Such Manjushri is the sickness of the bodhisattva. If he takes it otherwise, all his efforts will be in vain. For example, one is called hero when he overcomes all enemies. Just so one is called bodhisattva when one conquers the miseries of aging, sickness, and death. And the word bodhisattva, by the way, means enlightening hero. So he's sort of giving an etymology here. The word sattva can mean being, but it can also mean hero. And here it means hero, a hero of awakening. Okay, so now I want to jump to this. Okay, I have to read this segue into the bondage and liberation piece. Let me see if I can skip any of this. Yeah, I won't skip it. The sick bodhisattva should tell himself, just as my sickness is unreal and non-existent, so the sickness of all living beings are unreal and non-existent. Through such considerations, he arouses great compassion towards all living beings without falling into any sentimental compassion, dualistic and sentimental. The great compassion that strives to eliminate the accidental passions does not conceive of any life in living beings. So this is called great compassion, a concept very difficult to understand at first. The difference between compassion, the wish that others not suffer, and great compassion, which is the Mahayana idea. Great compassion, just like the transcendences have to be informed by wisdom, great compassion, in order to be great compassion, Mahakaruna, has to be informed by wisdom. And what that means is, just like we talked about, you see the emptiness of the giver, the gift, and the recipient. With great compassion, you see the emptiness or the voidness, the non-self-existence of the person you're helping. So while helping them free themselves be free from suffering, you also don't reify or see a real being who's really suffering, who, oh my God, I have to help them. In a way, you sort of see it as an illusion, or illusory, like an illusion. Or I talked in another talk about it's like waking somebody up from a nightmare. You recognize on some level the suffering for them is very real, the person having the nightmare, but you also know it's just a nightmare. It's not real. It's not real, at least in the way they think it's real. So that's great compassion. Doesn't conceive any life in living beings in that sense, intrinsic, separate life. Why? Because great compassion that falls into sentimentality, which is dualistic purpose of views, only exhausts the bodhisattva in reincarnations. A topic that comes up a lot, compassion fatigue, right? How do we avoid compassion fatigue? This is the Mahayan answer to that. But the great compassion, which is free of involvement with sentimentally purpose of views, does not exhaust the bodhisattva in all his reincarnations. He does not reincarnate through involvement. So now we're talking long term. Not just what does the bodhisattva do day to day, but over multiple reincarnations. All right, but the great compassion which is free of involvement with sentimentally purposive views does not exhaust the Bodhisattva in all his reincarnations. He does not reincarnate through involvement with such views, but reincarnates with his mind free of involvement. Hence, even his reincarnation is like a liberation. So remember we talked about samsara and liberation, or nirvana. Now this is the non-dual whole teaching of the Vimalakirti Sutra, is not seeing these as separate things. So his reincarnating in what appears to others to be samsara, for him actually is liberation. Liberation isn't off somewhere else on some cloud or something, or in some meditative state. And this whole discussion now is where we're going about, well, what is liberation anyway? And then what is the opposite of liberation? What is bondage? This is where we're going with this conversation, which is quite interesting. So, hence even his reincarnation is like a liberation. Being reincarnated as if being liberated, he has the power and ability to teach the Dharma which liberates living beings from their bondage. As the Lord, the Buddha, declares, quote, "It is not possible for one who is himself bound to deliver others from their bondage, but one who is himself liberated is able to liberate others from their bondage. Therefore, the Bodhisattva should participate in liberation and should not participate in bondage." All right, well, here we go. What is bondage and what is liberation? To indulge in liberation from the world without employing liberative technique is bondage for the Bodhisattva. Again, as I mentioned, every one of these sentences bears reading carefully and over again. So let's read that one over. For the Bodhisattva, we don't normally think of we think of bondage as me suffering, right? My bad karma is ripening and now I'm suffering. For the Bodhisattva, it's not, that's quite different. For the Bodhisattva to indulge in liberation from the world, now this is a reference in part, there's large amounts of conversations about this, not only in other sutras, but in many commentaries, about the criticism of, you can have a meditative experience, an aspiring practitioner can have an experience of emptiness. And in that experience of emptiness, in a meditative session, to the extent that one is experiencing emptiness in some real way, and there's a large spectrum there, but to the extent that one is experiencing emptiness or selflessness, one is sort of not reifying oneself, one's dropping that. To that extent and at that moment, one is actually liberated from samsara, one is being liberated. There is a lot of critique within Mahayana literature about indulging in emptiness. The critique of the individual vehicle is not only that at the end of the path you become an arhat, you think you just get to go off and be gone from samsara, leaving everybody else behind. It's not only is that selfish, but it's also actually kind of a dualistic idea that may not actually entail real selflessness. There's a lot of discussion about this in a lot of the commentarial literature about, on a practice level, not letting your emptiness be a dualistic emptiness that somehow is therefore kind of actually more nihilistic, or a sort of an experience of nothingness or experience of me not being here. Because then when you come back from your experience of emptiness, you're back, oh God, I'm back here again. And probably many of us have that, something like an experience like that. You can have all sorts of blissful or nice experiences in your meditation and feel like, oh, I've gotten a little bit closer to enlightenment or liberation or Buddha or God or something. And then you come off that experience and back onto the meditation cushion, and then you're back here again. What a disappointment. And a lot in the literature criticizes precisely that if that's the kind of experience you're having, it's dualistic, and it's called, they have all sorts of terms for it, but they call it, among other things, delighting in emptiness. And it's sometimes delighting in a pseudo-emptiness, actually. But even if it's a real emptiness, even if it's an actual experience of emptiness, if your experience of emptiness is something you just sort of go into and you delight in it, you sort of get off and just sort of being dissolved. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So you get into the form is emptiness piece of it, you dissolve things in emptiness, and you just stay there. There's something actually selfish about that, in a sense. And there's also something not, the full side of the equation, emptiness as form piece hasn't come back. Emptiness as form is engaging in the world in this illusory, non-dual way, in where compassion comes in. So anyway, he's critiquing that, among other things. So to indulge in liberation from the world without employing liberative technique, which is compassion, that is what bondage is for the Bodhisattva. To engage in life in the world, so you're in the world, out there on the subway, with full employment of liberative technique, that is liberation for the Bodhisattva. the opposite of what an arhat or somebody on the individual vehicle would want liberation to be, where they want liberation to be getting away from this mess. Here he's saying, not only do you not get away from it, you go into it. You actually you go into the hell realms. You go into the subway. You go wherever you're needed. And going in there with liberative technique, that is like Disneyland for the Bodhisattva. That's liberation for the Bodhisattva. Going into samsara with liberative technique and practicing that liberative technique, that's liberation for the Bodhisattva. To experience the taste of contemplation, meditation, and concentration without skill and liberative technique is bondage. To experience the taste of contemplation and meditation with skill and liberative technique is liberation. Wisdom not integrated with liberative technique is bondage. But wisdom integrated with liberative technique is liberation. So that is why, as I was saying at the outset, you can't separate ethics and wisdom as if these are two separate conversations. I mean, you can provisionally talk about them separately, but at the end of the day, they're so integrated. Wisdom not integrated with liberative technique is bondage, but wisdom integrated with liberative technique is liberation. Liberative technique not integrated with wisdom, the other way around now, liberative technique not integrated with wisdom is bondage, but liberative technique integrated with wisdom is liberation. So whichever one you start with, you have to integrate it with the other one. Well, how is wisdom not integrated? We're just going to read a little bit more. How is wisdom not integrated with liberative technique a bondage? Wisdom not integrated with liberative technique consists of concentration on voidness, signlessness, and wishlessness. Those are the three doors of liberation, three sort of synonyms of emptiness. So wisdom not integrated with liberative technique consists of concentration on, meditation on, voidness, signlessness, and wishlessness, and yet being motivated by sentimental compassion, failure to concentrate on cultivation of the auspicious signs and marks, on the adornment of the Buddha field, and on the work of development of living beings and its bondage. Again, if you're not familiar with the literature, that'll sound a bit strange, but development of the signs and marks really means perfecting the body, just developing the body side of Buddhahood. So essentially, it's like overindulging in the Dharmakaya and to the neglect of the Rupakaya. And the adornment of the Buddha field, those of you who've read some Buddhist texts know about Buddha fields and Buddha verses, basically like a pure land. It means, and that's what a lot of the sutra is about, is actually what is it like to make this into a Buddha field or a pure land, to see it that way and engage with it that way. How is wisdom integrated with liberative technique? What you want to do, a liberation. Wisdom integrated with liberative technique consists of being motivated by great compassion, and thus of concentration on the cultivation of auspicious signs and marks, so the body is in there, part of it, on the adornment of the Buddha field, you're engaged with the society and seeing it in a perfected way, and on the work of, development of living beings, all the while concentrating on deep investigation of voidness, signlessness, wishlessness, and its liberation. So you're engaged in the world, you're making things a Buddha field, you're inspired by great compassion, you're developing the Buddha body, while simultaneously keeping your cognition of voidness, signlessness, and wishlessness, which again, is all basically synonyms for emptiness. So that was the one way, right? There's four possibilities here, right? There's two things, wisdom and skill and liberative techniques, and either one of them can either be integrated or not integrated with the other one, and therefore liberation or bondage. So we get a total of four. Here's the other two of the four. Okay, what is bondage of liberative technique, starting with that, not integrated with wisdom? The bondage of liberative technique, not integrated with wisdom, consists of the bodhisattva's planting of the roots of virtue without dedicating them for the sake of enlightenment, while living in the grip of dogmatic convictions, passions, attachments, resentments, and their subconscious instincts. So it's essentially, you're practicing compassion and liberative technique, but because you're uninformed with by wisdom, you are not able to understand the cause and effect of the development of things, which happens when you dedicate them for the sake of enlightenment. And you're in the grip of dogmatic convictions. Here means, dogmatic convictions means really false views or views of the self. It means, in other words, is almost a synonym for lack of wisdom. If you don't have wisdom, you are under the sway of a dogmatic or a reificatory habit pattern. What is the opposite then? What is the liberation that is entailed by when you take liberative technique and you do integrate it with wisdom? The liberation of liberative technique that is integrated with wisdom consists of the bodhisattva's dedication of his roots of virtue for the sake of enlightenment, without taking any pride therein, lack of self, while foregoing all convictions, false views in other words, reifications, passions, attachments, resentments, and their subconscious instincts, not only intellectual but subconscious ones. And it goes on from there. So but we read the piece that I wanted to cover of those 4 things, because I think that's a really helpful passage to discuss how these two really have to work together. So let me see what time we are at, almost 8:30. I'll stop in maybe 5 or 10 minutes so we can have some time for discussion. The other things I just want to point out to you really quickly is, if you're interested in learning about the specific 18 Bodhisattva vows and 46 secondary vows, it's discussed in the Harvey book and the Kyom books I mentioned to some extent, but a really good resource are these websites here that I've linked to. And if we come over here to this website, this is the Berzin Archives. The main route is there. You can see Berzin Archives. To the top, berzinarchives.com. This is Alexander Berzin, who's a longtime Buddhist translator and practitioner, sort of Bob Thurman's generation. He's been around a long time, lives in Germany. He's created, translated for the Dalai Lama, translated many, many books. He's created a very impressive and important website, Archives. Basically all the teachings he's sort of been involved with or inspired by over the years. He sort of dumped them all and uploaded them onto his website. He has his translations are sometimes idiosyncratic. They're sometimes a little bit different. His choice of language is a little bit different than some other translators, but that's the case with most translators. So you have to work your way into his vocabulary sometimes. But it's a real wealth of information. So if you go to his website and just sort of search for anything, you'll find all kinds of articles on that topic. So for example, if you search for Bodhisattva vows, here's something on root Bodhisattva vows, and he mentioned, he modified it, but it's based on a book that he published called Taking the Kala Chakra Initiation, which is a book you can still buy from Snow Lion, 1997, which he published, with the consultation of the Dalai Lama before the Dalai Lama was giving the Kala Chakra Initiation. So he gives a long discussion about the background of what a vow is in Buddhism in general. Anyway, he gives a large precursor, which is very useful to read, and then gets into the 18 Bodhisattva root downfalls specifically. Praising oneself, belittling others, and then a commentary on what does that exactly mean. Not sharing the Dharma teachings, etc. I'm sorry we won't take the time to go through the 18 right now, but here they are. We've given you an overview. This is essentially, if the general idea is you're developing great compassion and you're developing bodhicitta and you're practicing the 6 perfections, that's basically Mahayana ethics. If you want to know how that spells out more specifically in terms of vows of what a bodhisattva is going to not do, that's when you get into these 18 vows. And there are actually ceremonies for taking the 18 vows, like formal ceremonies, where you go to a lama or preceptor and you actually take the 18 vows. Then most importantly, or equally importantly, he discusses, after the 18, he discusses what does it mean to maintain these vows. When people learn, maybe you can't see that unless I blow it up. When people learn of vows such as these, they sometimes feel they're difficult to keep and are afraid to take them. We avoid this kind of intimidation, however, by knowing clearly what vows are. There are 2 ways to explain them. First is that vows are an attitude we adopt toward life to restrain ourselves from certain modes of negative conduct. The other is they are a subtle shape or form we give to our lives. So I like the way he explains both of those. In either case, maintaining vows involves mindfulness, alertness, and self-control. With mindfulness, we keep our vows in mind throughout the day. With alertness, we maintain and watch on our behavior to check if it accords with these vows. If we discover we are transgressing or about to transgress them, we exercise self-control. In this way, we define and maintain ethical shape to our lives. And then he talks about the 4 binding factors of losing the vows. To actually lose them, to actually outright lose them, you actually have to almost try. You have to not regard the negative action. You're doing it on purpose. I don't even care. I'm going to do it again. You have to really want to break one of these vows. At least 16 of the 18. 2 of them are a little bit easier to break. And in all cases, the general attitude with the vows in general in Buddhism, at any level, is that you take them precisely because you're aspiring to have this kind of behavior become what's natural and automatic for you. And of course, that's not going to happen automatically. It's something you work towards, which means by definition, you're going to break them. So there's sort of an expectation. You don't have to feel bad from day one as soon as you break it, like, oh no, now I'm a bad person, and get it back into your pride of lowliness. What you do then is you acknowledge it, you recognize it, you look inward, why did I break it, what was going on there? You sort of admit it, you confession it, you disclose it, you retake the vow and you move on. That's how this works. So he discusses that as well. And there's not only breaking vows, but weakening the vows, and then retaking them. Strengthening weakened vows, meaning retaking them. So he has a lot of good commentary about that. And then, if you want, you can jump to, he has another page, I won't jump, but there's a link to it here about the 46 sort of sub-vows. It's in here somewhere. Which are an expansion of the 18 key ones, which again, I mentioned earlier, these 18 come from Shantideva's Shiksha Samuchaya text, his other famous text, other than the Bodhisattva Triavatara, and from the Akashagarbha Sutra. So after Asanga's time, in which we had a different sort of way of spelling out the specifics of Mahayana ethics, later on, as of Shantideva's time moving forward, you have this kind of becoming the normative list of specific vows that Mahayana practitioners would take on. Okay, last thing I wanted to say then, before we open it up, so that's those two links. Mind training, I won't go into that further other than to say this is this incredible genre of literature that opens up in Tibet. You can buy this book, which I highly recommend. If you really want to get into the Bodhisattva boot camp, as we call it, you need to read this material. So the Essential Mind Training book, this is short excerpts that's translated by Thupten Jinpa of a vast amount of literature. There's a larger version of this book, which is about that thick. This is essentially a distillation of this larger book. This is a genre of literature in Tibet. They tend to be very pithy, like 8 verses or 12 verses, 20 verses, that really distill the practice of what is it like to be trying to be a bodhisattva. And it's Bodhisattva boot camp because these kind of verses really get down into like, take no prisoners. Like it beats down the ego. It's like how to think in a way that really doesn't let your ego insinuate itself and sort of take, it has no space to like try to take over. How can you actually be egoless? How can you actually be altruistic? And what does it look like and feel like to be altruistic? And get around the ego's tricks. This kind of literature really discusses that. And here, whereas in philosophy the main thing you're working to dissolve or to analyze is the self-habit, self-grasping or the self-habit, right? That sort of seeing the self as a substantially existent thing, you're trying to analytically see through that. Here in mind training, the parallel to that, the flip side of that is the affective side. Well, what does that feel like? And here you're undermining self-cherishing as opposed to self-grasping or the self-habit. But they're two sides of the same thing in a way. One's sort of more cognitive, one's more affective. So in mind training, you're specifically working at undermining self-cherishing, where you're making yourself more important than others. Shantideva's book, again, is a key source for this, talking about equalizing self and others and then actually exchanging self and others. So the last thing I just wanted to talk about is daily contemplations or recitations. Maybe I'm going to stop probably, I think, let me see what time it is. We have maybe 25 minutes left. I can go into this if you're interested. Just some suggestions I have. Many of you may already have practices you're doing. I find it useful to kind of distill a very, very basic daily practice of what does a daily practice look like. And basically it comes down to these things. Homage to a Lama, there's a classic verse for that we could talk about. Some sort of taking refuge, again there's a 4-line verse for that. I actually prefer, I keep saying taking refuge, I prefer, both in Sanskrit and Tibetan, it's going for refuge. It's going to the Buddha for refuge. So you're going to go, which I kind of like better than taking refuge. There's something to me that sounds a little bit graspy about it. I'm going to take refuge in the Buddha or from the Buddha. We tend to say that in English, right? Take refuge in a cave. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can also go into a cave for refuge. And again, the nuances sometimes matter, and in both Sanskrit and Tibetan, the verb is to go. I go to the Buddha as a refuge. I go to the Dharma as a refuge. I go to the Sangha as a refuge. Generating bodhicitta, again, I can recommend a nice 4-line verse that one can say every morning. Doing the 7 offerings with mudras is something you can imagine. This all can be done. What's nice about a practice like this is it summarizes everything in a basic Mahayana Buddhist practice, and you can do this in 3 minutes in the morning and 3 minutes at night. Literally, can take 3 minutes. And yet it hits all the points. And the nice thing about doing this is actually recommended in all traditions, Mahayana traditions, that this be something you do in the first thing in the morning before you do anything else. Now, traditionally, you get up, you take a shower, you have a cup of tea, then you go to your shrine room and you take out your things and you sit down and you do your formal session. That's fine if you have the time to do that. If you don't have the time, which many of us don't, then what happens is, well, I didn't have the time this morning to do my big, huge, elaborate thing that takes half an hour, so I just didn't do anything. Instead of doing that, what I would recommend doing, what I like doing, is before I even get out of bed, I wake up in the morning and literally I'll sit up right there before I get up and do anything and just do these things. And it only takes 3 minutes. So you do that before you get out of bed. Then if you get hit by a bus or something happens or whatever, at least you set the tone for your day. And the whole idea here is to set the tone for the day. You're sort of setting the bookends for your day by taking refuge in the beginning of the day, generating bodhicitta in the beginning of the day, making offerings in the beginning of the day. You're you're setting up the context for your day, and you're trying to set an intention so that everything you now do for the rest of the day is within that context, is being motivated by bodhicitta and within the context of renunciation and refuge and so forth. Taking refuge has as much as anything to do with renunciation, but it also has to do with compassion. There's a lot of reasons. Taking refuge really means, or going for refuge really means, stating that what you're going to rely on as your fallback, as your real source of inspiration or support throughout the day are going to be those 3 things, rather than ego or money or something else, power, whatever. So the mandala offering is very nice, and probably you all know that. Again, it's a 4-line verse, the standard 4-line Tibetan verse with the little mandala mudra, and that is a very nice Saji Puja Jishin Meto Tram. You can say it in Tibetan or you can say it in English, and it's a very short verse that first talks about the sun and the moon and the mountain river and the 4 continents. It's sort of a particular vision of the universe, which even the Dalai Lama has said Buddhists are free to throw that out because now we think of cosmology differently with the sun and planets and so forth. But be that as it may, what's important about that mandala offering is the last 2 lines. The first 2 lines kind of describe that cosmological picture. That's kind of irrelevant. The second 2 lines are the 2 lines that say, Saji Puja Joshi Meto Jambi Rubbing Janita Images. Sanjay Shingdu Mikte Pulvayi. So Sanjay Shing is a Buddha field. Mikte Pulvayi. So visualizing this as a Buddha field and offering it. So basically you describe your universe. It could be planet Earth, it could be the entire multiverse. You sort of describe your universe that you externally live in. And now you say, I visualize that as a Buddha field. So invoke your Vimalakirti understanding at this point. You now see this, Meek. You see this as a Buddha field, you transform it into a Buddha field, and you offer it. You're offering it to the Buddhas, but in offering it to the Buddhas, of course, the Buddhas don't need it. You're really offering it to all sentient beings. By offering it, then the 4th line says, Sanjay Shingdu Mikte Pulvi, Drokum Namda Shingdu Chubarsho, may all sentient beings come to be born in a pure land. So describe the universe, visualize it as a Buddha field and offer it, and through the merit of that, you immediately dedicate that. Through the merit of having done that, may all sentient beings come to be born in a pure land. So that's a mandala offering. Very common thing done in any Tibetan ritual, right? You always do mandala offerings. You always do all these things. Homage to the Lama, refuge, bodhicitta, some kind of offerings. The 7 offerings are common. A mandala offering is the quintessential offering. Then at some point, meditation. At this point, you can dissolve. If you read Bob Thurman's Jewel Tree of Tibet, he gives a beautiful set of meditations where you basically visualize a refuge tree that would be appropriate for this. You visualize a refuge tree, you do these kinds of things, refuge offerings and so forth, in the presence of this refuge tree. And then at some point, when you're basically done with all this, you imagine, this is all like holographic light, jewel light that this is made out of. You imagine all that dissolving. You imagine the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas and everybody in front of you being delighted with what a wonderful Bodhisattva you're being today, and they dissolve into light into you as a blessing. And as they dissolve into you, so the entire meditation now dissolves into emptiness, And in that dissolution process, you imagine your state of mind sort of becomes fused with their state of mind. So you go into a state of combined, not just emptiness. It's not just you now sort of zone out. You have an awareness of a deep awareness of emptiness and still a perception of form. So the world is still there, but it's empty of intrinsic reality, but it still appears. And what does it appear as? It appears as a Pure Land. And it's also infused with compassion. So you sort of go into the sort of enlightened consciousness state in that meditation. You dissolve that, and then finally, when you're done, you come out of that, and you can stay in that state for 5 seconds or 5 minutes if you want. Then finally, dedicating the merit, of course, is always an important part of any practice, which is essentially taking the positive energy that was created there, and rather than just letting it ripen as good karma for you personally, you sort of put it away in a lockbox, or you give it a trajectory. You say, I'm pushing this in the direction. I only want any positive thing that may come out of this. I'm not interested in the results for me. I'm interested in only how it benefits other beings. And the way it's going to benefit other beings causally is, indirectly, is that if you wake up yourself to become a Buddha, so you dedicate it towards Buddhahood. And there's there's many, there's hundreds of well-known dedication verses you can get out of Shantideva's book, you can get out of various sadhanas and dharma centers. These are 3 ones I like in particular because they're very succinct. Gewadi and Nyulodak is a very well-known one. It's just sort of a generic one. By this virtue, basically, may I become a Buddha and bring all other beings to that same level. The second one, Changtra Semdrok Rinpoche, is a very important one. It's actually taken from Shantideva's book. It's a well-known verse. The Dalai Lama cites it often. And Changtra Semdrok Rinpoche, may bodhicitta arise in those in whom it has not yet arisen, and in those in whom it has arisen, may it not decline or be damaged, but increase. And there's 3 things going on here, and this is something that's written a lot about in commentaries as well, is that when you're developing bodhicitta, or anything for that matter, but bodhicitta in this case in particular, you want to do 3 things. You want to generate it first, have some inkling or taste of bodhicitta. And that's a very rare thing to do for anybody. But if you even get a slight taste of it, it doesn't mean that now you're on the road to Buddhahood. You can easily lose it. So on the one hand, you aspire to get that taste of what that's like. Secondly, you want whatever taste, whatever glimpse you got of it, you don't want it to decline or go away or be forgotten, to diminish. You don't want that to happen. So that's number 2. And number 3, you want it actually to increase. You want it to become more and more familiar, more and more robust, more and more strong. So here, the dedication prayer is, interestingly, asking that happen for other beings. May other beings, all sentient being, any given sentient being, so may bodhicitta develop in those in whom it hasn't yet arisen. Number 1. So those who haven't even thought of bodhicitta as something they'd want to aspire to, even altruism or compassion, may it arise within them, may it not decline with them, and may it increase forever, up and up. That's that second one. And the last one, Chaksal Watan Chuching Shapadang, is a very nice verse because it summarizes what's called the sevenfold puja, which you can read about in some of the commentary I mentioned in Crosby, Skilton, and Skilton Crosby's translation of the Bodhicharyavatara. They have a nice commentary about the sevenfold puja. The sevenfold puja, in brief, is a sevenfold ritual that evolved out of a lot of different Mahayana texts that became very predominant throughout all Mahayana Asia. And it involves paying homage, making offerings, number 2, confessing, disclosing mistakes that you've made, rejoicing in the merit or the good or the virtue that you've done and that others have done. So rejoicing in virtue. Asking that the Buddhas not leave, asking that Buddhas be here, that come here and stay here, asking that they teach the Dharma, and then finally dedicating the merit of all of that. So there's sort of a sevenfold thing here. This particular dedication verse encapsulates all 7 of those in a very short verse. So that's a verse you can look up. So that's a nice, but you can find your own. There's plenty of dedication prayers, whatever one strikes you as meaningful. And it's obviously helpful to memorize. It's not much to memorize. It's a couple 4-line verses. You can say it in Tibetan or English or Sanskrit or whatever you like. I prefer actually English. For years I did it in Tibetan because it was a nice way to learn Tibetan. Still do sometimes, but it has to resonate. It has to be something you feel. And actually another thing Shantideva says, I won't find the verse quickly here, but he actually scolds, this is back 8th century India. I mean, this is a common thing that Indians did and that Tibetans still to this day do, and Tibetans will scold each other for it all the time, is you learn a verse and you learn it by heart and you just rattle it off, right? You know, blah, 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 blah. And the words, because you can rattle it out, you can actually be, maybe some of you have this experience, once you have these things memorized, you can just rattle them off and actually be thinking about where you're going to go for lunch and what you're going to order. And it's amazing how your mind can do these two things. And Shantideva says in this one verse, I'll find it if you want me to, he specifically says, don't do that. You know, he's talking to his fellow monks at Nalanda. Don't do that. And if you do that, there's no merit. It doesn't count. Basically, it just doesn't count. If you're not mindful, if you're not aware of what it is you're saying, your body, speech, and mind have to all be engaged in this process. So that's another last little piece of advice or whatever. Something I find helpful. Then this happens to me quite often. I'll be doing any one of these, and I'll suddenly realize I've moved on to the next one, and I wasn't aware of what I was just said. I'll stop, go back and say it again. I'll make myself go back and mean it and feel it. And then say, okay, now move on to the next one. So whether you're saying it in English or Tibetan or whatever, try to make each one of them count and be aware of what you're saying and feel what it means. And then it has some sort of effect for, setting up the rest of your day. And you can do something similar at the end of the day to sort of close off the day. And then as I mentioned, I think here, right, a week ago, this is practice. This is then what you do the entire day. It's 24/7. I think maybe I said this at Jewel Heart. It's actually 7/24. It should be 7/24/60/60. It's 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 60 minutes an hour, 60 seconds a minute. It's just something you do all the time, right? The 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections, thinking about the ethics, bodhicitta, skilled liberative technique. This is something you constantly do. So the practice is not just what you're doing on your meditation cushion. Somebody asks you, did you do your practice today? That's almost a silly question because they think that means did you do your thing on the meditation cushion. Practice is all the time. This is practice. And that's why, again, it was important when you look at the 3 divisions of wisdom, ethics, and meditation, and you actually look at Kyon's argument based on various sutras, what sutras themselves are saying is that actually, the meditation piece, the language, is actually supportive. What the practice really is wisdom and ethics. It's those 2 things. And as we saw in Vimalakirti, those aren't things you practice separately. They have to be practiced in an integrated way. So if you're doing integrated ethics and wisdom to whatever degree you're capable of, 7, 24, 60, 60, then you're doing your practice. And you're doing Mahayana ethics. Okay, so ethics and wisdom. All right, so let's stop here. I will stop here. And happy to have discussion and conversation about anything.
Two quick questions.
Yeah.
Do you have a recommendation for a good English translation of the Vajrasattva mantra, the 100-syllable mantra?
I'm aware. No, I mean the short answer is I can't say this. Here, go get this one. I've seen many of them over time. Some I like better than others. I basically studied enough Sanskrit years ago that I sort of made my own translation of it. But no, I didn't write it down or anything. I just sort of look at the words, and that is actually a helpful thing to do. Is, to the extent possible, learn. The more Sanskrit you can learn, the better. I highly recommend. Really, even as a novice, even if you don't learn Sanskrit grammar and everything, you can learn the words. And Sanskrit it's an Indo-European language. It's related to Latin and Greek, so it will help you in the sense that a lot of the Sanskrit words will have cognate words in Latin, which then connect to words in English. So it'll help you remember the meaning. But with something like the 100-syllable mantra, many mantras do contain, in addition to seed syllables, right, om and an, hong, and so forth that you can't translate, they contain phrases, bits and pieces of phrases, and it definitely helps to know what those phrases are. So, I'm sorry, I can't say, here's a particular one. If I know translators I like. I've certainly liked Bob Thurman's translations, and I suspect he has translated it somewhere.
In the Bardo book.
Yeah, Tibetan Book of the Dead.
The Dead, he has it at the end. He says, I'm not going to translate it for you.
Oh, so he doesn't translate there, okay.
And then the second quick question is, we're talking about this critique of...
Let me just quickly say, what you can do is, I would recommend, is collect translations. In other words, just be on the lookout for them. And anytime you find a translation of the 100-syllable mantra, look at Berzin. I'm sure he probably has it. Look online, Google, but write them all down, and if you find 5 or 10 of them and put them next to each other, you'll start to triangulate, and you'll see there's common, like everybody agrees that this phrase is always translated this way, and there seems to be some discrepancy about this one, and everybody's wildly different on that one, and at least you'll start to get an idea, and you can start to triangulate your own version of a translation, and then find somebody who knows Sanskrit and ask them.
I've studied some Tibetan.
Okay, good.
And I would find it a daunting task.
Yeah,
To take what's that big black dictionary?
it's Sarat Chandra Das.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to do that would be tough.
Sure.
But anyway,
Yeah.
Maybe I'll try. The other question is, you made reference to the critique of emptiness, celebrating emptiness, and then having that become a symptom of duality.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the term you used?
Well, they use the term delighting in emptiness or delighting in emptiness or indulging in emptiness. You can also say, in other contexts, they'll say delighting in liberation or indulging in liberation. One of the authors, important Mahayana authors who writes a lot about this is Kamalashila. And why that's significant, Kamalashila, worked with Padmasambhava in terms of bringing Buddhism to Tibet. And they had the great debate, right, in Tibet, where they decided a lot of issues that precisely have to do with these kinds of issues. And one book I'm really interested in translating, I have several books I'll need to get out first, but if somebody hasn't done it before me, which would be fine if they do, but if nobody's done it, there's a book Kamalashila wrote. He wrote the 3 books called the Bhavanakramas, or Stages of Meditation, of which there's 3 books, and they've each been translated by different translators, but they're out there. It'd be nice to have them done coherently. Stages of Meditation, or Bhavanakrama. And he discusses a lot about misconceptions of what meditation is and isn't. A lot of it's about shamatha and vipassana. But one thing he's very critical, Kamalashila is very critical of, is misunderstandings of emptiness and non-conceptuality and various other things. He wrote a separate book, which is less well known. There's actually a sutra. It's called a Dharani, but it's like a sutra. So the Buddha spoke the sutra called the Avikalpa Pravesha Dharani Tika, which means entrance into non-conceptuality. And Kamalashila wrote a commentary on that called the Avikalpa Pravesha Dharani Tika, meaning commentary. So Kamalashila wrote this other book, which is a commentary on the sutra about what does it mean to go into non-conceptuality? What is non-conceptuality? And the reason why I think this is an extremely important book and topic is precisely because it's so misunderstood, particularly nowadays in Western Dharma centers, about what does it mean to be non-conceptual? Does it mean just not thinking? And he goes into this in great detail, Kamalashila does, and he's very, very clear it does not mean not thinking. It has nothing to do with not thinking. It's a particular type of thinking, dualistic reificatory thinking, that is specifically being critiqued by the Buddha. And to be in the non-conceptual gnosis of a Buddha doesn't mean there's no content there. It means there's no reified content there. It's something very, very different. And anyway, it's an important thing he exposes here, and something Tsongkhapa picks up on later on in Tibet. Very, very strongly ties back a lot of his exegesis to Kamalashila. But what's interesting about that is Kamalashila is kind of the intellectual wing working with Padmasambhava that kicks off the Buddhism initially in Tibet, which is Nyingmapa. And it's particularly Nyingma, Dzogchen, and later on Mahamudra teachings that sometimes can fall into, anybody can, but fall into this sort of trap of thinking that you're supposed to just sort of blank out your mind and not think. And yet it's right there in the beginning with Kamalashila. So, and this relates then to your question about delighting in emptiness, because Kamalashila directly brings that up, that thinking that you're somehow spacing out or sort of going off into emptiness or into liberation, and that's being non-conceptual. He specifically, he argues logically, but then he also argues by quoting different sutras. He puts together both kinds of arguments as to why that's an invalid understanding of non-conceptuality. So I have a book I'm working on finishing now is actually going to be citing some of that, so that'll be out, but it's a book actually on tantric practice having to do with why it is that, why you visualize it, why does Vajrayana practice involve so much visualization? And part of it actually, Tsongkhapa himself ties this to the Kamalashila issue of thinking that visualization is sort of mental proliferation, you're sort of like making your mind go crazy. And if it's done right, it's not that. It's actually, it should be empty of inherent intrinsic content. And to think that enlightenment should be free of content is similar on an exoteric level that Kamalashila is talking about, is similar in Tantra of thinking that you should somehow just have perfection stage, emptiness meditation, and have no deity and no mandala, no nothing. So it's an interesting debate that exists, or an interesting issue that comes up. But yes, the delighting in emptiness or indulging in emptiness or liberation is that side of that mistaken side. And it's interesting, you see that in Vimalakirti, right? 2,000 years ago in the Vimalakirti Sutra is very clearly something he warns against. Did you have a follow-up question on that, or? Okay, somebody else? Anybody else? Yes, Alex.
You mentioned the 3 stages of learning, is it? Or hearing, contemplating, and integrating?
Right.
And in integration, you talked about meeting a mentor, a Kalyana Mitra, a spiritual friend.
Well, Kalyana Mitra would help you with all 3 of those.
They would help you.
Well, they help
right,
you with,
they'd
really
be
help
the ones
you.
teaching.
They'd help you with all 3. They'd help give you the facts, and they'd help you with your contemplation. Although the contemplation is something you have to do because it involves doubting it and disagreeing with it and working it over, and But they could help
Right.
you. A Kalyana, a spiritual friend, could certainly help debate you and take the devil's advocate position. That's what they do in Tibetan debates, right? They actually
Okay.
purposely take on the role of things. Of course, things are intrinsically real. Of course, you have a self, and let me give you the reason why. And they'll argue why, and you have to argue against them.
Yeah.
So Kalyana Mitra would help you with that.
Okay.
The integration or bhavana part of it is something, again, you have to do yourself,
Yeah.
but they would teach you the techniques for how to do that.
What I'm wondering is how essential that piece is in your training yourself to learn. I mean, is it written about somewhere that there are like prerequisites? Look for this in a mentor, or
yeah.
try to be with a mentor at this stage of your learning for this long. Or
There's a lot written about what are the qualities of a good teacher. You can find a lot written about, translated into English, the qualities of what is a qualified lama. So the kinds of things you look for. Yes, there's a lot written on that. And they all say, and I would agree, that it really helps. It's never said that you can't get there on your own, but it's ridiculously difficult. I mean, you could learn how to play the violin, like Carnegie Hall level, but on your own with no teacher. But why? I mean, so it helps to find not just one qualified teacher, but more than one. And my own pitch for non-sectarianism, I'm a big, big believer in this. It really does help, partly because I was sort of inculcated with this. With the lamas I initially was fortunate to study with, Dr. Rinpoche and Dejang Rinpoche, ostensibly Sakya lamas in Seattle, really, really pushed the non-sectarian thing. They would say, we're going to give you all these Sakya teachings today, but Kala Rinpoche is coming to the US, we're going to invite him here, and he's going to give you the Kagi version. And oh, by the way, if you're ever go down to San Francisco, the Dalai Lama is going to be there, make sure you catch him. Ling Rinpoche, the throne holder of the Gelug's, bring him here, he's going to teach. Dujin Rinpoche of the Nyingma, he's going to come here, he's my good friend. We talk about Dzogchen all the time. So, I mean, he really pushed that. And to me, I found that very, very beneficial to study from teachers of all 4 traditions, and there's more than just 4, but the 4 main ones. It's confusing at first, it can be, because they each have a different way of talking about things. And it's not that they're all saying the same thing in different ways. Sometimes they are saying something different. And it can take 10 or 20 years to sort that all out and figure out exactly what are the differences and why are they different. What else are you going to do? I mean, it takes 10 or 20 years. Okay, it's worth it. So I would just encourage that, as opposed to what I see too often, which to me is sort of sad or disappointing, is people pick their one lama and that's it. And that's great. If you have the one special relationship with one mentor, that's wonderful. And if that's all you ever get, then that's also wonderful. But if that's all you get because you now close your door in your mind to studying with anyone else, I think that's a big loss. I think it enriches your understanding of your own tradition if you purposely study with some other teachers. So if you can find several to study with, read the books from the various traditions so you're informed, so that then when you do meet those lamas, you can ask them informed questions. You know, that helps. Yes?
I wonder if you would clarify this point. I recently heard that there is a bodhisattva ideal in the individual liberation vehicle with like 10 stages and stuff.
Sure.
So, because that is the basis often of distinguishing between Mahayana and...
The difference is that in the individual vehicle, of course they acknowledge in the Pali Sutras that the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni, was a bodhisattva. And therefore, and the Buddha not only, and there was 10 stages he went through. The Buddha not only, in the Pali Sutras, not only did he go through that, but he himself talks about not being the first one to have ever gone through that, nor will he be the last one. There's going to be other Buddhas in the future who will do that. So there's a general acknowledgement that there are other beings who do this. What is not acknowledged, and this becomes a little bit of a debate, what it appears to be saying, depending on what you look at and how carefully you look, what he appears to be saying in those individual vehicle Pali Sutras is, yes, others have done that, and I suppose if you wanted to try, you could, but you don't have to bother. It's enough that I did it. I became the Buddha for your sake. And really, you can just attain liberation. It's enough for you just to attain your own liberation, and I'm going to teach you how to do that, so let's get on with that. So he then teaches the individual vehicle. And he's not teaching that particular audience in those sutras how you would do the Mahayana. He talks about it obliquely, because he talks about what he did, and what is a Buddha, and why is a Buddha a little bit more than just a liberated arhat. What's the difference between just liberation and Buddhahood? He talks about that, but he doesn't really spell out fully the path, the how-to do that specifically. Nor does he say it's incumbent upon you to do that. What the Mahayana does is say, it has sutras where the Buddha is talking to a different audience, and then another audience, the Buddha is saying, actually it is incumbent upon you, you do have to do it, and here's how you do it. And oh, by the way, when I was talking to those other guys, and I didn't say I had to do it, that was because of skillful means, because it would have freaked them out. They weren't mature, they weren't ready for that. And in fact, I mean, the Mahayana sort of explanation in general is that Mahayana teachings in general, actually, civilization itself on earth was not really mature, at least on a public level, to hear the Mahayana was just pushing too far, pushing too much responsibility. And that's why the Mahayana wasn't really publicly fully revealed for 500 years. That's what they'll say. But even to this day, it's still the same kind of thing is said, in the sense that you get this in Nagarjuna's writing, in the Jewel Rosary, you get this everywhere. Remember, it's part of the Bodhisattva. If you look at the specific Bodhisattva vows, which we didn't, those 18 vows, 2 of the 18 specifically have to do with you don't push on somebody else emptiness or even the Bodhisattva view if they're not ready for it. That's actually breaking your Bodhisattva vow if you push that on them or explain that to them. On the other hand, if they are ready for it, maybe they're not practicing any spiritual path, or maybe they're doing individual vehicle Buddhism, but your assessment is they are ready for the altruistic Mahayana message. If you don't give that to them, that's also breaking a Bodhisattva vow. So you have to kind of get that just right. But the point is, with the first half, you don't go around pushing so even just as any Mahayana practitioner, therefore abides by that same idea. You only teach the Mahayana view and practice to somebody who's ready and willing to learn it. So anyway, that's what they'll say, is that what's by definition in the Pali Sutras is that. In the individual vehicle sutras, the Buddha was talking specifically to an audience who was ready to go to an extremely high level, the level of individual liberation, but not ready for the next. So in those sutras, he didn't teach it. And these sutras, he did. Yes?
Could I just ask you a few questions about sources, things I just didn't catch as you were speaking?
Okay.
The translation of the Guide to Bodhisattva's Way of Life, Padma...
There's a translation committee called Padmakara. 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 Padmakara.
And so if I Google that, I'll find
Yeah, and it's Shambhala, which has now been, Shambhala Press, and it's a red book. If you look on Amazon, you'll find it.
Okay. And the text...
And they call that the Way of the Bodhisattva. That's the Way of the Bodhisattva.
The Way of
is
the Bodhisattva.
the way they translate the title of the text.
Thank you. Which text discussed Nagarjuna's discussion of pride of lowliness?
Of what? Oh, pride of lowliness?
Yeah.
Yeah, pride of lowliness actually comes up in this text here, which is his Ratnavali or Jewel Rosary, translated by Jeffrey Hopkins as Buddhist Advice for Living and Liberation, Nagarjuna's Precious Garland.
Okay.
So he discusses it briefly in here. Shantideva's book that we just mentioned
Yes.
discusses, there he calls it the pride of ordinariness.
I'm sorry, Shantideva's book.
Yes, Shantideva's book, The Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life,
Right.
the Bodhicharya Avatar, has several verses scattered throughout the text where he zeroes in on this idea of pride of ordinariness or pride of lowliness. So both of those texts discuss it.
Okay, thank you.
And it becomes a major theme, as you'll see in the next talk. I hope you all come on Thursday. Please come to Jewel Heart for the talk on Vajrayana ethics, because as you'll find out, that is it actually interestingly becomes the key part of Vajrayana ethics, is working with or against the idea of pride of lowliness and pride of ordinariness. That becomes one of the primary focus points in Vajrayana ethics.
Thank you. And a source you'd recommend for the 8 worldly concerns and for the 6 perfections?
The 8 worldly concerns or obsessions is actually, I don't have a particular source, it's a topic that comes up everywhere. I mean, it's written in any kind of what they call Lamrim text, stages of the path. There's a whole genre of literature. But there was a book I mentioned the other night at Jewel Heart called The Tibetan Tradition of Mental Development. There's books by Gaelic Rinpoche, there's books, that first one's by Geshe Darge. But really, you'll find it just about everywhere.
Okay.
And I hope you were here when I went over those 8 in more detail, I think 2 sessions ago.
I'm sorry, I wasn't.
You weren't here, okay. So if you look at the tape, if you look at the videotape, I went over those 8 in some detail.
In which session?
I think it was it a week ago? Or was it a Jewel? Yeah, I think it was a week ago. Yeah. So if you look at the tape from a week ago here, I went over those in some detail. And then as far as the 6 perfections go, same thing, that's written about. I mean, any book on Mahayana Buddhism is going to go into that in detail. So I don't have one particular one I would necessarily recommend. As much as the more widely you can browse, the better. There are different authors, translators who I think are better than others, but we'd have to have a long conversation about that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, sure. In general terms, I would say as a general rule of thumb, any book that was written or translated within the last 20 or 30 years is got a better likelihood of being a good, reliable source. If you find something written on Mahayana Buddhism from the 1950s or 1920s, or it's less likely to be well informed, I would say. There's some exceptions to that, but you can almost date it from the 1970s onwards as being tend to be more reliable, more authoritative.
Thank you. What do you think of Alan Wallace's translation?
Alan Wallace is great. He's an excellent translator.
He wasn't on your list, so I wasn't being controversial. I was just being curious.
Yeah, no, Alan Wallace is fantastic. He's done a lot of very important translations, and he did one of the many translations of the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. That particular translation I don't like as much, only because he and his wife are working. They're doing a daunting task. They're actually trying to translate from both Sanskrit and Tibetan at the same time in that particular version, and triangulating between and putting the exceptions and footnotes. And it kind of makes the whole translation maybe not flow as freely as it could. But in general, he's an excellent translator and a very excellent writer too. His thinking about Western Dharma practice and Western Dharma hang-ups, and really good. Particularly his critiques of materialism are really good. As Meditations of a Buddhist Skeptic on that topic is really good. So his independent writings, I think, in addition to his translations, are excellent. His original book, what was it, Bridge of Quiescence, I think, is on shamatha. He's good, and he has a huge amount of material he's translated. A physicist too, which is what makes him so interesting. He's a trained physicist, an ex-Buddhist monk, fluent in Tibetan, therefore not so much in Sanskrit, but well trained, and he's therefore able to give a really interesting insights into when talking about Western material sciences and how they square and don't square with Buddhist ones. Very interesting dialogues that he comes up with between, and he's of course been very instrumental in the Mind and Life conferences with the Dalai Lama and scientists. Thupten Jinpa, I've mentioned many times, excellent translator and writer also, his own independent works. But on emptiness, if you want to really dig into that very difficult topic, his book, Self, Reason, and Reality in Tibetan Thought, I think it is a good book. But again, I'll mention again, I've mentioned it before, Bob Thurman's own translation, The Central Philosophy of Tibet, the actual translation is the deep, deep end. It requires a lot of preparation to tackle. That's his translation of Tsongkhapa's Lekje Ningbo. But his introduction, Bob Thurman's 180-page introduction, is a very, very good introduction because he brings in Western philosophical traditions, in particular the philosophy of language, Wittgenstein's understanding of language, deconstructive nature of reality through language, and then compares that to Madhyamaka and brings in Nagarjuna. It's a very good, succinct summary of Madhyamaka thought. But there's many others I could recommend if you're interested. So any last questions? I think we're probably running out of time. Yeah? Okay, maybe 1 minute. Any other questions or comments? Okay, one more here.
My question was...
Might wait for the mic, I think.
You had mentioned this phrase, Shunyata Karuna Garbha,
Shunyata Karanagarbha, yeah.
right? So I was just wondering, since it seems to be inbuilt in the realization of Shunyata that you develop this great compassion, why do we then also have like this whole literature on a path of being a bodhisattva?
Very good question. Difficult question. In other words, if I'm understanding your question right, if you fully understood emptiness, wouldn't you automatically develop compassion? And that's a very interesting question, and they do say you don't. And the way I understand it, and this is something that is written about, Chandrakirti, among others, specifically writes about this. He's a great 6th century Indian philosopher who's central to Madhyamaka writings. He and others write about this. Basically the idea is that compassion is like a muscle. It's like a muscle you develop. So if we think about the term skill, and compassion is just a sentiment, right? So it may be the case that with a deep understanding of emptiness, it is the case necessarily with a deep understanding of emptiness, you automatically, because it's the same thing, you get a deep understanding of interconnection or relativity, right? So not only Shunyata Karanagarbham, but another verse by Nagarjuna, says Yashunyatam Praditu Samapadam Madhyama Pratipadam Cha. These are all eka artha, so these are synonyms. Shunyata, emptiness, Pratitut Samatpada, interdependence, and the middle way, Madhyama Pratipada, these are synonymous. He says that in several texts. So interdependent origination or relativity is a synonym for emptiness. They mean the same thing. That you should always remember that, because otherwise you can start thinking emptiness means nothing somehow. It means relativity. So a deep understanding of emptiness automatically entails a deep realization and perception of interconnection. And in that sense, you could say it automatically would generate some feeling of compassion, of connection. So self-other barrier drops, interconnection increases. So yes, in terms of an affective feeling of compassion, that would be there. But the ability to actually act on that skillfully and powerfully is in the Mahayana, they say it's a separate skill set that you then develop. And that's why, in a way, it's called upaya. It's skillful means. It's a skill, like shooting an arrow or playing the violin. It's actually a skill you develop, or I like to think of it as like a muscle you build up. So in the Mahayana, they say it's something you have to build up in parallel with, and they obviously inform each other, but it's still a skill set you build up. And the arhats, in the individual vehicle, they don't build it up, and it's to their detriment. And in fact, they say, from the Mahayana point of view, it's actually a problem. It's actually a huge setback, ironically. If you actually take the individual vehicle at face value and if you go along it for a while and at the appropriate point switch over to the Mahayana, great. But if you go along the individual vehicle all the way to arhatship, first of all, from the Mahayana perspective, the arhats think, yay, I'm done, I'm here in nirvana now. And the Mahayana critiques, they actually have this in sutras, is that at that point the arhat is precisely thinking he's in liberation, somehow disconnected or something. And at that point, after a billion aeons of floating in this nirvana, the bodhisattvas will come up, Buddhas and bodhisattvas will come along and sort of knock on their consciousness and say, hello, wake up. Time to get on with the Mahayana now. Now you have to become a Buddha. From the Mahayana perspective, everybody's going to become a Buddha. There's no exception to that. Everyone's become fully awakened Buddha. The arhat actually now is at a huge disadvantage because they've so disconnected themselves, in a sense, with emptiness that they actually don't have the way they talk about it is the mud of samsara that helps to develop compassion. In other words, they've developed so much detachment, they're not able to empathize with what attachment feels like. And so it's actually harder for them to develop great compassion and bodhicitta and so on. Whereas ordinary people like us, if we develop enough, you have to develop the inclination towards liberation, which ties in with selflessness, but then steer it towards and integrate it with compassion and use the mud of samsara to develop compassion. Then you can develop Buddhahood much more quickly. But it is something that they say you develop these two things, and they do develop. They develop integrated. I don't want to say they develop separately. You develop them in an integrated way, but there's two separate things you're developing: wisdom, insight, and compassion, upaya, bodhicitta. It doesn't just automatically come. So, but it's a good question. Very good question. Okay, so.
That's why Padmasambhava was a lotus born, came from the mud.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot about, the metaphor of the lotus being born from the mud. That's what one of the many things that the lotus symbolizes, is compassion comes from the mud of samsara, exactly. Well, thank you, and I hope to see you all Thursday night. Thank you.
This video was brought to you in part through the generous monthly support of the Tibet House US membership community and viewers like you. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, please visit our website at tibethouse.us. Together, we can make a difference. Tashi Delek, and thanks for watching.